Listen up, anime-only adventurers. If Season 1 of The Beginning After the End left you stunned and hungry for more, you're exactly where you need to be. The anime may have stopped, but Arthur Leywin's journey is far from over. In this video, the story continues right where Season 1 ended. Diving straight into the Manhwa chapters the anime hasn't touched yet. Stronger enemies, deeper secrets, and the real beginning of Arthur's rise. Drop a like, subscribe, and get ready, because this is where TBATE truly begins. 2 full years had slipped by since the world last shook, but time didn't stop just because the chaos ended. Life kept moving. Cities breathed again. People laughed, fought, drank, and dreamed. Yet beneath all of it, something invisible was changing. The continent wasn't at peace. It was evolving. Inside the Dragonspine Inn, the air was thick with sound and heat. Tankards slammed against tables. Laughter bounced off the stone walls. The smell of roasted meat and bitter ale mixed into something heavy enough to taste. Adventurers packed the place shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising and falling in waves of excitement, drunken bragging, and half-true stories meant to impress strangers. But in one corner, away from the noise, tension simmered. Kagul sat hunched forward at a worn table, his fingers wrapped tightly around his mug. His eyes were sharp, restless. He leaned closer to the small group gathered with him and lowered his voice, like he was about to say something dangerous. The Masked Swordsman. The name alone shifted the mood. A thick-necked brute beside him snorted, waving it off with a scoff. That fairy tale again? Please, people believe anything these days? Before Kagul could reply, a skinny man with tied-back hair slid into an empty seat, eyes wide with excitement. He leaned forward eagerly, practically vibrating with gossip. I know someone who's fought alongside him, he whispered. Swears on his life. The guy travels with Jasmine. Says he's young, barely looks old enough to drink. But when he moves, you can tell. That man's dangerous. The table stirred. Then Turman slammed his mug down hard enough to splash ale. His face twisted in irritation. Enough, he growled. I'm sick of hearing about this ghost. A seasoned B-class augmenter, Turman carried years of blood, scars, and pride. And every rumor about this masked swordsman felt like a personal insult. Clearing dungeons alone? Rising ranks like it's a joke? He spat. I've trained my entire life, and I wouldn't dare do that. No one could. Especially not some kid swinging a blade without even using magic. His words dripped with bitterness. The table erupted, some laughing, others arguing back. A few suggested maybe Jasmine was doing the heavy lifting. Others claimed the masked swordsman was blessed by the gods themselves. As the alcohol flowed, the egos grew louder, and soon one man even bragged that he could crush the masked swordsman without breaking a sweat. Kagul stayed quiet, but his thoughts burned. The rumors wouldn't stop. Wherever he went, people whispered that name. Some said the swordsman skipped ranks entirely. Others swore he'd reached A-class in under 2 years. 2 years. That detail hurt the most. Kagul had clawed and bled just to hover on the edge of C-class, failed the promotion exam 3 times, pushed himself until his body screamed, and still the door never opened. Meanwhile, someone else soared. For veterans like Turman, it wasn't just envy anymore. It was humiliation. Then the door creaked open. The sound cut through the tavern like a blade through cloth. Kagul's fork slipped from his hand and clattered against the table. His breath caught in his throat. A man stepped inside. A mask covered his face. The room didn't go silent, but something shifted. The air felt heavier, colder. The kind of stillness that comes right before a storm breaks. The masked swordsman had arrived. Turman stood up immediately, chair scraping loudly against the floor. A wide grin spread across his face, fueled by ale and wounded pride. Well, look who decided to show up, he sneered, voice dripping with mockery. What, cat got your tongue? Thought you'd be taller. Kagul shot to his feet, panic flashing across his face. Turman, stop! Don't! Too late. The veteran stepped forward, taunting, baiting, trying to provoke a reaction. The masked swordsman didn't even look at him. He simply walked past. That dismissal was the final insult. With a roar, Turman yanked his massive greatsword from his back. Mana exploded around him in blinding silver arcs as he raised the weapon high. Don't you ignore me! Kagul shouted again, his voice cracking. You'll get us all killed. The sword came crashing down. The impact shook the inn. Wood splintered, dust erupted, glass rattled. People screamed, convinced they'd just witnessed a murder. But when the dust settled, the masked swordsman stood untouched. The blade had struck the floor beside him, carving a crater deep enough to swallow a leg. Not a scratch marred his body. Slowly, calmly, he turned his head. His eyes glowed faintly blue, cold, sharp, inhuman. Turman snarled and ripped the blade free, swinging again and again in wild fury. Each strike missed. Every slash cut nothing but empty air. The masked swordsman barely moved. A tilt of the shoulder, a shift of the torso. Effortless, precise, untouchable. Turman screamed, lifting his weapon one final time. And then, a sound like air tearing, a flash too fast to follow. Silence. Something fell to the floor with a wet thud. Fingers. Turman's fingers. Blood dripped slowly as his sword slipped from his ruined grip. A broken groan escaped his throat. The masked swordsman stepped forward and calmly pressed his boot down on the fallen blade, pinning it to the floor without a word. The pressure vanished from the room like a storm passing overhead. Everyone gasped, lungs burning, as if they'd been underwater. Kagul collapsed back into his seat, shaking. His heart hammered violently in his chest. That pressure, that wasn't fear alone. It was instinct, a warning from something ancient inside him. Turman stood frozen, face pale, mana still flickering weakly around the man who had just dismantled him without effort. And the masked swordsman stood there in silence, power barely restrained, as the entire Dragonspine Inn realized one thing. The rumors weren't exaggerations. They were warnings. Cold, piercing eyes met Turman's stunned stare, and the masked man spoke only a single sentence, calm, flat, and merciless. "Are you done?" The words hit harder than any blade. Kagul snapped out of his paralysis like someone dunked him in ice water. His heart slammed against his ribs as he rushed toward Turman, shouting for help. His voice cracked as he begged someone, anyone, to bring a bag of ice, screaming that maybe, just maybe, an emitter could still reattach the fingers if they acted fast enough. Blood pooled across the tavern floor, dark and sticky, soaking into the wooden planks. The crowd that once laughed and mocked now murmured in fear. No one joked anymore. No one breathed too loudly. The mood had flipped from drunken bravado to primal survival instinct. Meanwhile, the masked swordsman had already turned away. He walked back toward the counter where the waitress stood, frozen in place, her skin pale as snow, eyes wide and unblinking like she'd forgotten how to exist. Her hands trembled as if they might fall apart entirely. In a calm, almost gentle voice, he asked for his rations. Under the name Note, her head bobbed rapidly as she scrambled to grab the sack from beneath the counter, nearly dropping it twice before finally placing it in his hands. He gave her a respectful nod, quiet, polite, almost human, and turned to leave. Not a single soul spoke, not until the door closed behind him. Outside, Jasmine was already waiting near the horses, arms crossed, posture relaxed but alert. When she spotted him, she raised an eyebrow. "Took you long enough," she said. "What happened in there?" Arthur shrugged like nothing worth mentioning had occurred. Rations were hard to find. Her eyes drifted to the faint splatter of dried blood on his mask. And right, she didn't push it, but her half-lidded stare made it painfully clear she didn't buy his excuse for a second. Arthur didn't elaborate. He simply reached up, removed the mask, and revealed a completely calm expression. No wounds, no stress, not even a scratch. Jasmine sighed and shook her head before swinging up onto her horse. "Let's move." Arthur followed beside her, the rhythmic sound of hooves filling the air as they resumed their journey. The road stretched on, quiet and endless, and as the wind rushed past, Arthur found himself reflecting on the last 2 years, the years that reshaped him into something sharper, stronger, and far more dangerous than the boy he once was. Jasmine had pushed him relentlessly. She'd helped him sharpen his skills, refine his instincts, and climb all the way to A-class. Everything they'd done together had been leading toward this dungeon. Now it was finally within reach. As they rode, Arthur pulled out a piece of parchment and began to write. The letter was addressed to his parents. He told them where he was, how far he'd come, and asked them to wait just a little longer before he returned home. He mentioned Lilia, now awakened, and imagined the proud chaos she must have caused already. He joked that Vincent was probably over the moon. He asked them not to overwhelm her with tutors, to let her grow naturally before sending her off to Xyrus Academy. He wrote about Jasmine too, how she continued to teach him wind magic, how he returned the favor by helping her refine her swordsmanship. He even bragged a little, saying he'd broken into the light orange stage and grown strong enough to nearly beat his father in arm wrestling. The letter was warm, honest, full of gratitude. He ended it with a promise. This dungeon would be his final mission before school. In just a few weeks, he'd be home. Jasmine glanced over. "You done writing?" Arthur nodded. "Yeah, the stable master will make sure it gets delivered once the horses return." She smiled faintly. "Roran trained them well. Doesn't matter where we let them go, they'll always find their way back." Arthur agreed. Leaving mounts unattended near a dungeon was dangerous, especially with magical beasts roaming nearby. Jasmine reminded him that the rest of the party was likely already waiting. Then she asked casually, "What about Sylvie? Is she joining us this time?" Arthur hesitated. "She's still watching. Her thoughts are clearer now, but she says she's not ready yet." Jasmine hummed in understanding. "Probably wants to get stronger before you start school." That explanation felt right. They pushed forward, riding for several more hours until the forest thickened and the air grew heavy. Finally, Jasmine slowed her horse. They'd arrived. The trees opened into a wide clearing hidden deep within the woods. At its center stood the dungeon entrance, silent, ominous, and waiting. A group of adventurers had already gathered. Some were packing away supplies, others tightening armor straps or checking weapons. Arthur dismounted, Jasmine right behind him. That's when he felt it, a familiar presence. He looked up, and there he was, Lucas, the same fire conjurer from the exam. Arms crossed, expression sour, eyes sharp with thinly veiled irritation. Arthur sighed inwardly. Of course, Lucas wasted no time pointing out that they were the last to arrive. Before things could spiral, another man stepped forward with a friendly smile and an air of authority that instantly calmed the group. "Reginald Brooks," he said, extending a hand. "I'll be leading this operation." Arthur accepted the handshake, gripping firmly. Reginald's eyes sharpened slightly. That grip told him everything he needed to know. So the rumors were real. Reginald introduced himself properly. An A-class augmenter specializing in earth magic. wielding a massive warhammer. He gestured toward Lucas next. A class conjurer, dark yellow stage, fire attribute. Lucas didn't look pleased about the introduction. Next came a broad-shouldered man with a relaxed grin. Creole Masser, water attribute. I'll be your tank. His presence radiated stability. Then another figure stepped forward, and Arthur recognized him instantly, one of the B-rank candidates from the exam. Elijah Knight, the man said. A class conjurer, dark orange core, earth attribute, solid, reliable, precise. Oliver stepped forward next, his presence quieter than the others, but far from weak. He was an emitter deviant, specializing in healing magic, the kind of role nobody noticed until everything went wrong. His tone carried a faint edge of arrogance, like someone who knew his value and didn't need to prove it. But Arthur couldn't deny the comfort that came with having a competent healer nearby. In a dungeon, that kind of support wasn't just helpful. It was the thin line between walking out alive and becoming another nameless corpse. Before the tension could settle, a burst of cheerful energy crashed into the group. Hi, I'm Samantha, but everyone calls me Sammy. The girl practically bounced as she spoke, her smile bright enough to cut through the heaviness in the air. She introduced herself as an A-class conjurer, dark yellow core, specializing in water magic. Her presence was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and her excitement spiked the moment she noticed the masked swordsman. Her eyes sparkled like she'd just met a celebrity. Oh wow, you're really him, aren't you? She blurted out, clearly trying and failing to contain herself. Her enthusiasm softened the mood instantly. Even the tense adventurers nearby relaxed just a little. Reginald gestured toward the final member of the group. A broad-shouldered man stepped forward, confidence rolling off him like heat from a forge. Brawled Landon, he said evenly. A A-class augmenter, light yellow core, fire element. His voice was steady, grounded, someone used to command and chaos alike. As the highest-ranked adventurer present, the authority naturally fell to him. Arthur could tell immediately. This man had seen real battle. Brawled gave the group a brief but measured nod before turning his attention to Jasmine. She stepped forward smoothly. Jasmine, A-class augmenter, light yellow stage, wind element, dual swords. Brawled returned the nod, clearly pleased. Another high-tier fighter meant better odds. Then it was Arthur's turn. Still under his alias, he spoke calmly. Name's note, a class augmenter, light orange stage, fire element. A few heads turned. Samantha blinked. Wait, fire? I thought you didn't have an element. Arthur shrugged lightly. I didn't, for a while. That answer only deepened her curiosity, but she backed off, sensing there was more beneath the surface than he wanted to explain. Brawled glanced at the gear strapped to Arthur and Jasmine's backs. No dimensional rings? Both of them shook their heads. Brawled looked toward Lucas, clearly expecting him to step up. Lucas scoffed and turned away. Mine's full. Oliver chimed in smoothly. I'm already carrying Samantha's equipment. For a moment, it looked like the issue would stall them, until Elijah spoke up. I still have space. He activated his dimensional ring, and with a subtle shimmer, Arthur and Jasmine's packs vanished into storage. Arthur blinked. He hadn't expected that. Dimensional rings were ancient relics, artifacts from the era when the floating city of Xyrus still ruled the skies. Even the smallest ones cost absurd amounts of gold. That Elijah had one at all said more than words ever could. Arthur nodded in appreciation. Thanks. Elijah returned the gesture with a calm smile. Brawled stepped forward again, voice firm and commanding. All right, that's everything. Let's move. The dungeon awaited. This wasn't just any dungeon. It was AA rank, a death sentence for anyone below A class. Only elites were allowed inside. According to Brawled, a hidden tunnel within led to an unexplored section that had only recently been discovered. That was their objective. The group moved out, weapons ready, minds sharp. They entered a narrow tunnel carved deep into the mountain's spine. The slope dipped downward, the air growing colder with every step. Moisture clung to the walls, and each footstep echoed unnaturally, as if the cave itself was listening. Arthur walked beside Brawled, who held his shield high and sword ready. The silence stretched, too long. Lucas muttered something under his breath. This is weird. Not a single mana beast. That was when the tunnel opened. They stepped into a massive cavern, at least 50 yards across, bathed in a dim, eerie blue glow. The source was unclear, but it painted the jagged stone in ghostly light. Above them, stalactites lined the ceiling like rows of fangs. Then the sound came, a low growl. It echoed once, then again, then multiplied. Brawled narrowed his eyes. Shapes began dropping from the ceiling. Dozens of them. Bat-like creatures with 4 muscular limbs instead of wings. Their fur bristled, eyes bloodshot, teeth bared. Bat runners. Formation, Brawled shouted. Conserve mana. The cavern exploded into motion. Creel slammed his shield forward, crushing one of the beasts mid-air and sending it crashing to the stone floor in a shriek of pain. Brawled struck his own shield with his blade, the sound ringing like a war drum. Hold the line! Oliver began chanting, mana swirling around his hands as his focus sharpened. Jasmine moved instantly, daggers flashing as she positioned herself defensively, her stance fluid and deadly. Reginald and Creel flanked her, weapons raised, timing their movements with practiced precision. Reginald was the first to kill. His warhammer came down like divine judgment, crushing a bat runner into the cavern floor in a burst of gore. Elijah followed, slamming his palm into the ground. Jagged pillars of earth erupted upward, impaling several creatures mid-air. Their bodies fell lifelessly around them. Brawl charged through the chaos, carving through the swarm with brutal efficiency. But even as he fought, he shouted over the noise. "Stop wasting energy." His voice cut through the battle. "Killing these things won't end it." The team tensed, because that meant only one thing. This was just the beginning. They needed to conserve mana. Every drop counted down here. Arthur lifted his sword, ready to move. But before he could even take a step, the air around him ignited. Heat exploded outward. Lucas had already activated his spell. Fire Cyclone! A roaring inferno burst from his staff, spiraling outward like a living storm. Flames tore through the cavern, swallowing the air itself. The temperature skyrocketed instantly, scorching the stone walls black. Screeches echoed as dozens of Batrunners were caught mid-flight, their bodies igniting before they could even react. Burnt wings folded in on themselves as they dropped like ash from the sky. Lucas stood tall in the aftermath, flames still dancing around him, a smug grin creeping across his face like he'd just put on a show for an audience. But Brawl wasn't impressed. He stormed forward and grabbed Lucas by the collar, lifting him just enough for their eyes to meet. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Brawl roared. Lucas scowled. "I ended it fast. Saved everyone the trouble." Brawl shoved him back hard. "This isn't some playground dungeon. You just wasted mana we might need later." Lucas scoffed. "They're dead." Brawl's eyes darkened. "No, they're not." Arthur stayed silent, but he understood exactly what Brawl meant. This was the dire tombs. Nothing here truly stayed dead. The creatures inside weren't bound by normal life or mana cycles. Kill them, burn them, shred them, it didn't matter. Eventually, they crawled back. No core, no reward, just endless repetition. That was why this place was feared. That was why adventurers avoided it unless absolutely necessary. The flames died down, leaving behind scorched stone and silence. Brawl exhaled sharply and motioned forward. This way. He led them to a narrow opening carved into the cavern wall, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look. "This is it," he said. "The hidden passage." Elijah stepped forward without hesitation. Lifting his hand, he shaped the stone itself. Thick earthen grips formed along the wall, like steps grown from the rock. One by one, they climbed. When they reached the top, Brawl paused. "This is as far as I got last time." His gaze darkened. "Whatever's causing the reanimation, it's deeper. Probably an artifact." Creel shrugged casually. "As long as I get paid, I don't care what's waiting." Brawl snorted and motioned onward. But just before they moved, his eyes flicked upward. Thousands of Batrunners clung to the ceiling above them, completely still, silent statues of death. No one breathed. Slowly, carefully, the group slipped forward. Elijah raised a hand behind them, sealing the passage with a wall of earth. The bats remained still, watching. The next corridor was narrow, tight enough that only 4 people could walk shoulder to shoulder. The tension eased slightly, but Arthur's instincts screamed something was wrong. Then, click, a faint metallic sound, then another. Arthur moved instantly. He stepped in front of Samantha just as thin metallic projectiles shot from the darkness. His blade flashed, deflecting the darts with sharp metallic clangs that echoed violently down the corridor. Sparks flew. Samantha gasped. "Thank you." Reginald spun toward Brawl. "Traps? Since when?" Brawl clenched his jaw. "There weren't any before. I swear it." Oliver rushed to Samantha's side, checking her quickly. She nodded, shaken but unharmed. Arthur's eyes narrowed. He could hear it now, soft scraping along the walls. Movement. These weren't traps, and they were being hunted. "Those weren't mechanisms," Arthur said calmly. "They're alive." That made things worse. Traps could be learned. Creatures could adapt. Brawl kicked aside one of the darts, his voice grim. "Stay alert." They continued forward, every step cautious, every breath measured. Eventually, the corridor widened into another cavern, larger than the last. The heat hit them instantly, dry, suffocating. The ground was riddled with deep holes, scattered unevenly like wounds in the earth itself. Brawl slowed. "Careful, something's wrong." Arthur felt it too. Not heat, pressure. Like something massive was watching them from just beyond reach. Brawl warned everyone to avoid the holes. Gas vents. They erupt without warning. They navigated carefully, and then the ground exploded. A violent eruption tore through the floor as something massive burst upward in a shower of rock and flame. Creel reacted instantly. He slammed his shield into the ground, conjuring a massive wall of shimmering water that absorbed the blast. The creature emerged fully, a colossal worm, thick as a tower, its body glowing red with internal heat. Its mouth could swallow a person whole. Everyone froze. Brawl stared in disbelief. That wasn't here before." Creel frowned. "New monsters don't just appear in sealed dungeons." Brawl nodded slowly. "Exactly." The ground trembled again. Then, without warning, the massive creature retreated, diving back underground and vanishing completely. Silence followed. The hole it left behind yawned like an open grave. Elijah spoke quietly, breaking the tension. "This place is changing, and whatever waited deeper inside was waking up." Arthur studied the crater in silence, his eyes tracing the jagged edges where the ground had collapsed. Whatever had burst out of there wasn't random. It was calculated, alive, thinking. Before anyone could speak, Oliver, still riding the high of his earlier confidence, suddenly stepped forward. "Hey, wait," Brauld called out. Too late. Oliver shoved past him like the danger didn't apply to him, marching toward the far end of the cavern with reckless confidence. Samantha's instincts screamed at her. Her breath hitched as she reached out, but her voice came a moment too late. "Oliver, don't—" The ground trembled. A deep, violent rumble surged through the cave, followed by a sickening hiss, like something boiling under unbearable pressure. Arthur's eyes widened. "Lucas! Barrier! Now!" Lucas froze, panic flashing across his face as his mind struggled to catch up. Arthur didn't wait. He lunged forward, grabbing Brauld by the collar and yanking him backward with all his strength. The instant he did, a violent explosion of yellow gas erupted from the ground where Oliver had been standing. "Now!" Arthur shouted again. Lucas snapped out of it. A blazing wall of heat erupted around them as he threw up a heatwave barrier just in time. The gas slammed into it with crushing force. The pressure rattled their bones. Visibility vanished instantly as steam swallowed everything. Samantha reacted on instinct, summoning a flowing barrier of water to reinforce the shield. The two elements clashed violently, filling the cave with scalding mist that burned the lungs and blurred vision. Seconds stretched like hours. Then silence. The steam thinned. The barrier faded. What remained made everyone freeze. Oliver was gone. What stood where he had been was a half-melted skeleton, blackened and warped, bits of scorched flesh still clinging to bone. Smoke curled lazily from the remains. No scream, no struggle, just instant death. Brauld clenched his fists so hard his knuckles cracked. "Damn it!" Arthur stared, jaw tight. One reckless move, 1 second too slow. That was all it took. He crouched beside what was left and retrieved the gem embedded in Oliver's gear. It still pulsed faintly with mana. His eyes flicked to Samantha's core, fractured, unstable. Without a word, he tossed the gem to her. She caught it, stunned. "Arthur, replace it," he said firmly. She didn't argue. Arthur stood and turned to the group, his voice sharp, commanding. "We move, now." No one questioned him. Brauld nodded grimly and added, "If we stay here, we die." They moved quickly through the twisting tunnels, the air growing heavier with every step. The silence felt wrong, too heavy, too expectant. Then the ground shook again. The massive worm burst forth once more, erupting directly in front of them, its armored body coiling like a living mountain. Before anyone could react, "Creole!" Brauld shouted. Creole launched forward, slamming his shield into the earth. A wall of rushing water exploded upward, colliding with the monster's charge. The impact sent shockwaves rippling through the cavern, but it bought them precious seconds. Elijah moved instantly, slamming both hands into the ground. Stone erupted in a massive ring, snapping shut around the beast's midsection like a vice. "Now!" Brauld barked. Jasmine darted forward, blades flashing, drawing the creature's attention, while Reginald stepped into position. Impact blast! His hammer ignited with blinding yellow energy as he leapt skyward, spinning with brutal momentum. The strike landed with an earth-shattering boom. The cave roared. Dust exploded outward. But instead of collapsing, the stone bindings shattered. The creature roared, unharmed. Fear rippled through the group. Lucas faltered. His magic hadn't worked before. And now, then Arthur stepped forward. "Move." He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He moved. Acid sprayed toward him in violent arcs. Arthur weaved through it with unnatural precision, his movements sharp, deliberate. He drew his blade. Mana surged. Sear! The flames vanished, compressing inward until the blade glowed red-hot from within. A glob of acid flew toward his face. He struck it aside effortlessly, liquid hissing harmlessly against the stone. In that opening, Jasmine moved. She vaulted off his shoulder, spinning through the air, daggers flashing like silver lightning. She drove both blades deep into the gash Arthur had carved moments before. The creature shrieked. The sound was deafening. Its body convulsed violently before it tore itself free and vanished underground in a violent retreat. Silence followed. Brauld exhaled hard. "We're alive." No one argued. He straightened and nodded sharply. "We move. Now." As they advanced, he clapped a hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "Good instincts." She gave a short nod, already scanning ahead. Lucas scoffed under his breath. Wasn't even that strong. The moment the words left his mouth, the ground rumbled. The hiss returned. Arthur's eyes widened. Without hesitation, dark crimson flames burst around him as Phoenix's cloak ignited. Heat rippled outward in waves. Lucas froze again. Jasmine spun, summoning a violent vortex of wind that tore through the incoming gas before it could reach her. The air screamed. The cave trembled, and somewhere beneath them, something ancient stirred, angrier than before. She reached out instinctively, fingers stretching toward Arthur, but his attention had already snapped elsewhere. Lucas. Before anyone could even shout, Arthur moved. He lunged forward, boots slamming against the stone as he threw himself between Lucas and the surging wave of boiling acid gas. The moment he planted his feet, dark crimson flames erupted around his body, wrapping him like a living shield. Phoenix's cape flared violently, roaring against the incoming torrent. The explosion hit. A deafening hiss filled the cavern as the superheated gas gas slammed into Arthur's barrier. The impact sent shockwaves rippling through the tunnel, shaking loose chunks of stone from the ceiling. Heat crashed against him in suffocating waves, trying to burn its way through his defenses. Behind him, Lucas froze, too slow, too stunned to react. The flames around Arthur screamed louder, absorbing the punishment head-on. His boots skidded across the ground as he was pushed back inch by inch, but he held his ground. The gas finally began to thin. Steam rolled across the cavern floor like fog, swallowing everything in sight. One by one, silhouettes emerged through the haze. Samantha stumbled forward first, coughing, her arms covered in angry red burns. Jasmine leaned against the wall, breathing hard, her skin blistered but intact. Reginald knelt on one knee, panting, his armor warped and scorched. Then Arthur's eyes locked onto Brauld. His heart sank. Brauld had taken the worst of it. His right arm, his sword arm, was completely ruined, charred black, skin torn apart, muscle barely holding together by shredded strands of flesh. Smoke curled faintly from the wound as blood dripped onto the stone below. Arthur's expression hardened instantly. Brauld had shielded Samantha instead of himself. Reginald rushed to him, grabbing his shoulder and holding him upright. His voice shook as he urged him to stay conscious. Brauld gritted his teeth, refusing to scream, but the pain was clearly tearing through him. Arthur stepped forward slowly. Without hesitation at all, he raised his blade. In a single clean motion, he severed the ruined arm. Blood sprayed, splashing across the stone. But before panic could erupt, Samantha surged forward. Her hands glowed as she wrapped the wound in layered bands of water magic, sealing veins and stabilizing the flesh. Steam hissed as the bleeding slowed to a stop. Silence followed, heavy, suffocating. The group stood frozen, staring at the aftermath. Arthur exhaled slowly, finally letting the tension drain from his shoulders. Then, from the side, Creole stepped forward. Despite the carnage, he was smiling. Not a mocking smile. Not madness, just quiet warmth. He held out something in his hand. A sandwich, rough bread, dried meat, a bit of cheese peeking out the side. "My dungeon snack," he said softly. "For moments like this." Arthur blinked, caught off guard. Still, he accepted it with a nod. Creole explained, almost shyly, that these were made using his fiancée's recipe. She insisted they were best when warmed just right. Arthur gave a faint smile. With a flick of his fingers, a gentle flame bloomed in his palm. He warmed the sandwich carefully, just enough for the cheese to melt. Creole's eyes lit up. "Hey, could you do mine too?" Arthur did. They sat there in the middle of a shattered death trap, quietly eating like this was some roadside break instead of a nightmare dungeon. The food was surprisingly good, rich, seasoned perfectly. Arthur nodded in approval. "You're lucky," he said honestly, "to have someone like that waiting for you." Creole smiled wider than before, pride flickering through the exhaustion. For a brief moment, everything felt calm. Then it shattered. Reginald's voice cracked through the silence, sharp and furious. "Enough!" Lucas snapped back immediately, venom in his tone. He blamed the entire situation on Brauld, said he only joined because he was promised a competent AA rank leader. Now look at them, down a healer, half dead, and trapped in hell. Brauld clenched his jaw, eyes burning. He shot back that Lucas was the one who froze, the one who dropped his weapon, the one who had to be saved. Lucas scoffed, claiming he was never in danger, that it was Brauld's own incompetence that got him crippled. Brauld roared back, shouting that he'd taken that hit to save Samantha. Something that never would have happened if Lucas had acted when he was supposed to. The tension snapped. Arthur stepped forward. His voice cut through the argument like steel. Cold, calm, absolute. He looked straight at Lucas. "Power means nothing if you're a liability." The words landed hard. "If you can't think beyond yourself," Arthur continued, "then you're better off walking this dungeon alone." Lucas glared, jaw clenched, but said nothing. After a moment he turned away, fury simmering beneath the surface. Reginald exhaled heavily and shifted his focus back to Brauld. He told him to rest and recover what little he could. Arthur crouched beside Brauld. His voice softened. The truth was unavoidable. Everyone else had burns, bruises, exhaustion. But Brauld had lost an arm. This wasn't something he could shrug off. Arthur told him plainly, if he wanted to stop, no one would blame him. For a long moment, Brauld said nothing. Then he lifted his head. His eyes were steady. "This'll be my last dungeon," he said, "but I'm finishing it." Samantha gasped, shaking her head. "How could he fight like this?" Brauld met her gaze calmly. "I'm still AA rank. I won't slow you down." Then he turned to Arthur. "I want you to lead." The words stunned the group. "You've stayed calm. You made the hard calls. You kept everyone alive." His gaze sharpened. "You're the leader now." One by one, the others nodded. Even those who doubted him before didn't argue. Arthur accepted without ceremony. "We rest 1 hour," he said. "Then we move." After the brief recovery, they stood once more, worn, burned, but alive. With Arthur at the front, they pushed deeper into the dungeon, toward whatever nightmare waited next. The corridor that followed was noticeably shorter than the ones before it, almost deceptively so. But at its end stood something that immediately demanded attention. A massive set of double doors unlike anything they had encountered so far. The surface was completely covered in strange, ancient runes, etched deep into the metal as if carved by hands long erased by time. The symbols weren't just unfamiliar. They felt wrong, humming faintly with a quiet, oppressive mystery that settled into the air. Brauld stepped closer, studying the doors with a deep frown. Unease crept into his voice. as he muttered that this entire section felt off. During his last visit, this tunnel had never been sealed. There had been no doors, no barrier, nothing like this. Reginald joined him, calm as ever, running his gaze across the carvings. He admitted he couldn't read the runes, but something else caught his eye. Thin cracks webbing across the structure. Whatever power these symbols once held, it had likely long since faded. To him, the doors were old stone and metal, nothing more. Without waiting for further discussion, Reginald lifted his silver warhammer and brought it down hard. The impact rang through the corridor like thunder, sparks bursting outward, as the sound echoed endlessly through the dungeon. The doors didn't move. His jaw tightened. Calling upon one of his core techniques, Reginald's hammer flared with light as he shouted the spell's name and struck again. This time the doors trembled, just slightly, but still refused to open. Jasmine stepped forward silently. Reginald met her eyes and gave a brief nod. In perfect sync, they charged. Jasmine's mana surged through her dual swords, wind screaming along the blades, while Reginald unleashed another empowered strike. Their combined force shook the ground beneath their feet. The doors groaned in protest, metal grinding against metal. And then, click, a narrow gap appeared. Reginald wasted no time. He jammed his thick fingers into the opening and growled as he forced the doors apart, muscles straining as the gap widened. What waited beyond made everyone freeze. It wasn't stone. It wasn't darkness. It wasn't a dungeon. Beyond the doors stretched a vast meadow, impossibly wide and vibrant. Lush grass rolled endlessly into the distance, glowing with a soft emerald sheen like it had been polished by sunlight. The air was bright, warm, and peaceful, yet there were no torches, no crystals, no visible source of light at all. For a moment, it felt like they had stepped out of the earth entirely. No one spoke. The beauty of it stunned them into silence. Arthur didn't relax. His eyes narrowed as his gaze swept across the open space. There were no pillars, no supports, nothing holding up the ceiling, if there even was one. This space shouldn't exist underground. His instincts screamed that this wasn't natural. Samantha whispered in awe, barely able to contain herself. Creel stretched his arms lazily and yawned, cracking a joke about how this looked like the perfect spot to rest. He mentioned how suddenly sleepy he felt, like the tension had drained straight out of his bones. Arthur didn't smile. The calm here felt too perfect, too clean. He turned sharply and told everyone they weren't stopping. His voice carried authority now, firm and unyielding. Whatever this place was, it wasn't safe. Creole blinked in confusion. To him, it was just grass and open space. No monsters, no sounds, no movement, nothing dangerous. But Arthur's unease only deepened. As they moved farther into the meadow, that discomfort clung tighter, crawling up his spine. The serenity felt manufactured, like a beautiful lie. His instincts screamed danger, yet nothing presented itself. Then the atmosphere shifted. A thin mist began to rise from the ground, curling around their legs. At first it seemed harmless, but within seconds it thickened, swallowing the grass and creeping upward. Visibility dropped rapidly, until his teammates were reduced to vague silhouettes drifting in white haze. That's when Jasmine stiffened. Her eyes locked onto something moving within the fog. A smile. Faint, twisted, not human. Arthur saw the tension in her stance. She had seen something too. Then the silence shattered. A heavy thud echoed through the mist. Creel froze. His voice cracked as he called out a name, raw emotion flooding his tone. Clara. Hope trembled in his outstretched hand. His shield slipped from his grasp and hit the ground with a dull clang as he took a step forward, staring at something only he could see. Before anyone could stop him, Creel broke into a run. The mist swallowed him whole. Arthur lunged after him, but Jasmine grabbed his arm, gripping tightly. Her eyes were sharp now, filled with understanding and fear. The truth hit him all at once. This wasn't a physical threat. This was worse. Illusions. The mist wasn't hiding enemies, it was creating them. Arthur shouted for everyone to stay together, warning them not to trust what they saw. This place wasn't attacking their bodies, it was attacking their minds. He turned to Samantha without hesitation and ordered her to raise a barrier. Still shaken, Samantha forced herself to focus. Her chant echoed softly as water mana surged outward, forming a translucent sphere around the remaining group. It didn't block the mist entirely, but it gave them something solid, something real, to cling to. Inside the barrier, Samantha finally asked the question hanging over everyone. Who was Clara? Reginald's expression darkened. He told them the truth. Clara had been Creole's fiancée, an adventurer, strong, brave. She had died in a previous dungeon raid, her death confirmed beyond doubt. Even Brauld spoke up, voice heavy, recalling the day he had witnessed her fall. And the cremation that followed. The weight of it settled over them like lead. Reginald gripped his hammer tighter, guilt flashing across his face. Creel hadn't run toward danger. He had run toward hope. Lucas scoffed, frustration boiling over as he lashed out, questioning everything. The dungeon, the team, their leadership. But his words rang hollow now. Arthur turned to Jasmine. She stood rigid, jaw tight. He asked if she was all right. After a pause, she admitted the truth. She had seen someone too, not an illusion of comfort, her father. Standing there, smiling, arms open, as if welcoming her home. And that was when Arthur understood just how dangerous this place truly was. The memory had shaken Jasmine far more than she wanted to admit. For a split second, her usual sharp composure had cracked, and Arthur caught it immediately. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Not commanding, not urgent, but steady. He reminded her that she was still here, that she was safe, that whatever she had seen in the mist wasn't real. Jasmine drew in a slow breath, then another. The tension in her shoulders eased, just slightly. Her lips curved into a faint smile, not carefree, but resolute. She nodded once, silently reaffirming herself. The illusion had rattled her, but it hadn't broken her. Arthur didn't linger on it. His attention snapped back to the thick mist coiling endlessly around them, rolling and shifting like something alive. His instincts screamed that standing still was a mistake. With urgency threading his voice, he asked Jasmine if she had any wind spell capable of driving the fog back. She shook her head. Clearing it entirely was beyond her. This wasn't normal mist. It was saturated with mana, woven deeply into the dungeon itself. But after a moment's thought, she added that she could try something else. She could carve a path. Not wide, not permanent, just enough to push through and search for Creel. That was all Arthur needed to hear. He ordered the group back into Samantha's water barrier, giving Jasmine space. At its center, Jasmine planted her feet firmly against the stone floor. Wind mana gathered. At first it was subtle, gentle green currents spiraling around her wrists, brushing against her sleeves. Then the air thickened, pressure building as the currents grew faster, sharper. Her hair lifted as if caught in a rising storm. She raised her arms, palms trembling slightly, as the spell demanded more mana than she usually pushed at once. Her voice echoed through the chamber as she began the chant. The words grew stronger, clearer, carrying authority as the magic responded. The swirling gusts compressed, spinning violently, until two compact tornadoes formed at her sides. With a sharp exhale and a decisive motion, Jasmine slammed her palms together. The wind exploded forward. The mist was torn apart violently, shredded as if ripped by invisible claws. Fog scattered in every direction, and for the first time since entering the meadow, a clear path opened before them. Relief sparked, briefly. Then the mist fully parted. What lay beyond made every heart sink. Dozens, no, hundreds, of thick vines and twisted branches writhed across the ground, crawling toward them like a living tide. Roots scraped against stone, tendrils coiling and snapping as they advanced with terrifying intent. Hope vanished instantly. Arthur's mind raced. None of this had been visible earlier. And worse, Jasmine's spell hadn't even slowed them. The vines hadn't burned, hadn't recoiled, hadn't reacted at all. That realization sent a chill through him. These weren't normal plant-type mana beasts. He barked Lucas's name, sharp and commanding, cutting through the rising panic. This was his moment to prove he belonged here. Lucas reacted with raw frustration, fear twisting into anger. He raised his staff and unleashed Crescent Ember. A curved blade of searing fire ripped through the air and slammed into the advancing vines, lighting them up in a burst of brilliant flame. For a heartbeat, the vines recoiled. Then they kept coming, unscathed. Lucas stared, stunned, disbelief flashing across his face. Arthur didn't allow the moment to linger. He ordered Reginald forward immediately, commanding him to shield the conjurers while they prepared stronger spells. Reginald responded without hesitation, stepping into position like a wall of iron. Arthur then turned, issuing rapid orders to Jasmine and Brauld to prepare support. At the same time, he flooded his body with mana. Heat surged through his veins, concentrating in his arms and flowing directly into his sword. He wasn't waiting anymore. There would be no miracle here. They were cutting their way through, or dying trying. Jasmine was already beside him, twin daggers drawn, wind mana wrapped around her blades, humming sharply as she moved in perfect sync with him. No words needed. Brauld roared and charged ahead. One arm, burned body. No hesitation. He threw himself into the writhing mass, swinging his sword with brutal force, each strike filled with raw defiance. There was rage in his movements, pain, and something else. An outright refusal to die here. Arthur followed fast. The vines surged endlessly, snapping and twisting, trying to overwhelm everything in their path. Arthur narrowed his eyes, analyzing even as he fought. Fire wasn't working the way it should. The reason clicked almost instantly. Moisture. These vines were saturated with it, water mana woven deep into their structure, dampening flame and dispersing heat before it could do real damage. So Arthur adjusted. He tightened his mana flow, activating Searing Edge. The flames around his sword collapsed inward, condensing into a thin, blinding red layer along the blade's edge. No wildfire, no wasted heat, just pure, focused destruction. He slashed, roots severed cleanly. Again, thick vines fell apart in smoking heaps at his feet as he carved forward relentlessly. Jasmine matched him step for step, her daggers flashing as she shredded anything that slipped past him. But Brauld was slowing. With only one arm, he couldn't keep pace. The vines regenerated faster than he could cut them, coiling around his legs, his torso, pulling him down inch by inch. Still he laughed, hoarse, defiant, shouting that he wouldn't fall here, not as an AA-class augmenter. Arthur swore, and he couldn't tell if Brauld was being reckless, or if he'd already made peace with dying here. Arthur didn't give him the option. He surged forward, blade blazing, diving into the mass of vines. His movements were sharp, precise, almost surgical. He sliced a path straight through the tangled mess and yanked Brawled free just as the roots began to tighten around his chest. Dragging him back, Arthur snapped at him, reminding him of his earlier words. If this really was his final raid, then he needed to survive it. The team still needed him alive. Before Brawled could respond, Lucas finished another spell. Liquid fire. Thick crimson flames sprayed outward, coating the vines in burning fuel. Arthur, Jasmine, and Brawled leapt back instinctively. This time Arthur felt a flicker of surprise. Lucas had chosen the correct spell. The fire spread rapidly, but then the dungeon itself reacted. The mist hissed and surged, smothering the flames almost instantly. The environment was actively resisting them. Then Reginald shouted, and a massive wave of vines was rushing Elijah from the side. Brawled moved before anyone else could. Despite his injuries, he threw himself forward and cleaved through the vines with a desperate swing, stopping them inches from Elijah's position. Elijah met his eyes and gave a silent nod of thanks. Then Elijah raised his hands. His voice cut through the fog as he cast his spell. Crater. The ground beneath the surging forest of vines suddenly gave out, collapsing inward with a violent roar and tearing open a massive pit. The charging tendrils plunged straight down, snapping and unraveling as the earth swallowed them whole. What remained skidded to a halt at the edge, forced to recoil. For the first time since the nightmare began, the relentless pressure eased, just barely, granting the group a fragile breath of relief. Arthur didn't waste that moment. His eyes scanned the pit with sharp focus. Vines were still tumbling into the abyss, and the scorched residue of liquid fire clung stubbornly to the edges. Together, the fire and the drop formed a temporary dead zone, an obstacle that would slow the vine's unnatural regeneration. It wasn't a solution, but it was a pause, and pauses were priceless. Then Samantha stepped up. Already drained, she forced herself forward and began channeling mana into a spell no one expected to save their lives. Aqua Siphon, a spell meant for drawing water from the air, used for survival training and convenience, not combat. Yet in this hellscape, she twisted it into something vicious. The strain hit her immediately. Her knees slammed into the stone as mana burned through her veins, but the spell activated all the same. The air itself responded. Moisture was ripped from the cavern in visible currents, streaming toward Samantha as if she were the eye of a storm. The once lush vines reacted instantly. Their vibrant green dulled, color draining away as they shriveled and cracked. Thick tendrils curled inward, turning brown and brittle, collapsing lifelessly onto the stone as their internal moisture was violently stolen. What moments ago had been an unstoppable tide now looked like dead foliage. Arthur registered it instantly. Sharp, impressed. A utility spell. Turned lethal. Brilliant. But victory never came easy. Before the spell could fully finish its work, the mist filling the cavern shifted. No, moved. It surged unnaturally, spiraling with intent, like something exhaling. The fog rushed toward the withered vines, soaking them in an instant. Life snapped back into them violently. Green exploded across their surface as they regenerated at a terrifying speed. Thicker, stronger, angrier than before. Arthur's breath caught. This wasn't just regeneration. This was supply. His eyes lifted, tracking the mist upward as realization hit him like a hammer. The vines weren't the enemy. They were extensions. Then the fog finally thinned, and the truth revealed itself. Towering above them stood a colossal figure, easily over 20 yards tall. Its presence dominated the cavern like a living fortress. A massive, humanoid shape, fused with ancient roots and bark, its body layered with twisted wood and coiled muscle hardened by time. Every movement carried the weight of centuries, the slow inevitability of something that had existed long before them and would continue long after. The group froze. Horror settled in. They hadn't been fighting the beast. They had been fighting its toes. The Elderwood Guardian had been standing there the entire time, hidden by mist, letting them exhaust themselves against fragments of its body. An S-class mana beast, a monster said to be nearly invincible in dense terrain. Samantha's strength finally gave out. She collapsed fully to her knees, trembling, her voice barely holding together as she whispered its name aloud. The moment she said it, the weight of that title crushed the room. Brawled, still barely standing from his wounds, stared up at the giant in silence. His lips parted, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked. Not in anger, not even fear, but utter despair. The gods, he muttered, must have truly abandoned them. Arthur saw it immediately. That wasn't frustration. That was surrender creeping in. Even Reginald, the unshakable wall, faltered. His grip on the warhammer loosened, the weapon dipping as his gaze drifted, not at the beast's face, but lower, toward its torso. Something was embedded there. Reginald's arm slowly lifted, finger trembling as he pointed. Lodged deep within the guardian's body was a broken, lifeless form. A man, half swallowed by bark and vine, limp, unmoving. Creole. Arthur's chest sank. The delusions had won. While they fought for survival, Creole had been drawn into the monster's core, his mind lost in illusion. In his final moments, He hadn't been running from danger. He had been chasing a dream. Clara, his long-lost fiancée, a ghost that never existed. Even now, faint and distant, his voice echoed weakly through the cavern, begging someone who wasn't there not to leave him behind. Then the guardian moved. A massive limb tightened, vines constricted. Creel's body folded under the pressure. The sound was sickening, bones snapping, flesh breaking, sharp echoes ricocheting off the cavern walls. One final squeeze, and then silence. Reginald screamed. It wasn't a shout, it was grief made audible. Rage torn straight from the soul. His entire body shook as he seized his warhammer with both hands, veins bulging, mana erupting wildly around him. Arthur saw the look in his eyes and lunged forward to stop him. Too late. Reginald charged. His roar thundered through the chamber as he slammed his hammer into the ground. The impact shattered the stone beneath him, cracking the floor like glass. A violent shockwave exploded outward, debris and dust blasting in all directions. Arthur was thrown off his feet, sent skidding backward, the force knocking the air from his lungs. Jasmine shouted his name, panic tearing through her voice, but it was swallowed whole by the chaos Reginald had unleashed. The Elderwood Guardian reacted instantly. Vines lashed out toward Reginald, surging like executioner's chains. But Elijah moved just as fast. He slammed his staff down, earth mana roaring to life, as jagged stone spikes erupted upward, intercepting the vines mid-strike and shattering them apart. A window opened, a narrow chance to escape. Jasmine seized Arthur's arm, dragging him toward the entrance they had come through, her grip tight, desperate. But Arthur didn't move. His eyes never left the battlefield, the people still fighting, the promises he had made. Her voice shook as she spoke, raw and honest. She reminded him of her vow, not to the team but to his family. She had sworn to protect him, even if it meant abandoning everyone else. Arthur's answer was silent but absolute. He wasn't running, not like this. Jasmine saw it, felt it. Her grip loosened. After a heartbeat, she nodded, steel returning to her eyes as she turned back beside him, ready to stand, even if it meant dying here. Ahead, Elijah raised a thick stone wall, angling it against the Guardian's advance. The response was immediate. The beast formed a lance from its vines and hurled it forward. The projectile smashed into Elijah's defense with catastrophic force, obliterating it in a shower of rock and dust. And in that moment, Reginald moved again. He hauled his hammer up, mana surging uncontrollably as golden light engulfed the weapon. His heart was shattered, but his resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. With a final furious cry, he charged the monster. The hammer screamed with power, and as he swung, Reginald unleashed Impact Barrage, slamming straight into the Guardian's weapon, declaring war against something that should have been untouchable. A violent chain of concussive impacts detonated in rapid succession, each blow hammering harder than the last. The force rippled outward, pulverizing the Elderwood Guardian's vine-formed lance until it shattered completely, exploding into shredded coils and splinters of bark. For a single heartbeat, it looked like Reginald had done the impossible. That heartbeat was all he got. The destroyed fragments didn't fall away. Instead, they moved. The broken vines writhed as if alive, snapping back together with horrifying speed. They twisted and braided around Reginald's body, looping around his arms, chest, and legs. The mass tightened, constricting, reforming into the same monstrous weapon, but this time Reginald was trapped inside it, fused into the structure like raw material. Arthur's blood ran cold. The battlefield erupted into panic as Arthur barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. He shouted to Elijah, commanding him to cover Jasmine while she retrieved Brawled, then get everyone to the exit immediately. No hesitation, no arguments. Elijah locked eyes with him and nodded, already shifting his stance to move. Then the sound came. A wet crushing noise echoed through the cavern, the unmistakable sound of a body being compressed, bones snapping under impossible pressure. Reginald's final moments played out inside the beast's newly reforged lance, his hammer, his body, his unbreakable spirit. Everything was swallowed, crushed, and repurposed into the very weapon meant to slaughter them all. Arthur turned sharply, grabbing Samantha by the shoulders. She was frozen, eyes wide, breath shallow, staring at where Reginald had been. Arthur shook her hard, forcing her to move as he pulled her along, his mouth open to shout for Lucas, ordering him to burn away the vines around what remained. And then pain exploded through his chest. A blast of fire magic slammed directly into Arthur, launching him backward like a rag doll. He crashed hard into the stone floor, air ripped from his lungs in a violent gasp. The world spun. Samantha was thrown aside, skidding across the ground, untouched by the flames but shaken and disoriented. Silence fell. Everyone stared. Lucas stood there, staff raised, mana roaring around him like a wildfire. His face was twisted, not with fear, but fury. Pride burned in his eyes, sharp and unhinged. He wasn't thinking. He couldn't. Everything he believed about himself had collapsed. None of his spells had worked. None of his power mattered. He had been raised his entire life hearing he was exceptional, a prodigy born of a powerful bloodline. And here, in this fight, he was nothing. That realization shattered him. Lucas scanned the battlefield, the dead, the dying, the hopeless struggle, and made a choice. Not to fight, not to help, to leave. He began ranting about legacy, about duty, about survival, In his warped mind, preserving his bloodline outweighed the lives of everyone standing beside him. He lifted his staff again. Another blast of fire erupted, slamming Arthur off his feet once more before he could even rise. Jasmine screamed and ran toward Lucas, desperation written across her face, trying to stop him. Lucas didn't hesitate. He coldly warned her to stay back, and when she didn't, he unleashed another wave of flames. The explosion hurled Jasmine into a jagged rock wall. The impact knocked the air from her lungs and sent her crumpling to the ground, unconscious. Elijah rushed to her side, but the aftershock caught him too, throwing him off balance. Elijah snapped. Rage tore through him as he demanded to know what Lucas thought he was doing. Lucas didn't even flinch. His voice cracked with madness as he sneered at them, calling them commoners. He claimed their deaths would be remembered as noble sacrifices, while he escaped to live on. Then he cast a smokescreen. Thick gray fog swallowed him whole. Through the haze, Lucas cast one last arrogant smirk over his shoulder, before turning his back on them and vanishing into the mist. Elijah stepped forward, shaking with fury. His glasses cracked and smeared, but before he could pursue, the ground shuddered violently. The Elderwood Guardian roared. The sound was monstrous, primal, shaking the chamber to its core. Shockwaves tore through the cavern, slamming Elijah into the rocky ground. He hit hard, blood spraying from his mouth as pain ripped through his body. Then the vines moved again. From the crater Elijah had created earlier, thick, living tendrils surged upward, coiling and twisting like serpents. They closed in around him rapidly, blocking every escape. Elijah screamed, pure terror breaking through his composure as he realized he wouldn't get out in time. Then heat flooded the battlefield. Fire ripped through the vines in a blazing inferno, reducing them to cinders in seconds. Through the flames charged Brawled, his body engulfed in flickering magical fire, his single arm gripping his sword tightly. The blade burned red-hot with augmentation, radiating raw destruction. Brawled laughed. It was wild, unhinged, fearless. He screamed a challenge straight at the towering mana beast, daring it to face him. The Elderwood Guardian answered with a guttural roar that shook the ground beneath them. Brawl didn't slow down. He sprinted forward, racing up the massive vines themselves, using them as a path. His laughter echoed through the cavern as he reached the top and brought his blazing sword down with everything he had. Flames erupted, engulfing the Guardian's vines in a violent inferno. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like it worked. Then the fire dimmed. Smoke curled upward as the beast's regeneration devoured the flames. The vines twisted tighter, smothering the heat until it vanished entirely. Brawl froze. His grin faltered. There was no time to run. The Elderwood Guardian lunged. Its massive jaw-like limbs opened wide and snapped shut. Brawl was gone. No scream, no resistance. Just gone. Elijah, barely conscious, dragged himself across shattered stone and debris toward Arthur. He reached out, trying to check on him. Arthur was barely moving. Blood spilled from his lips, his breaths ragged and shallow. His vision blurred, but his mind was racing. The battlefield was collapsing. Too many were dead, too many mistakes. Arthur forced himself to think through the pain. Even if he activated the first phase of his beast will, it wouldn't be enough. There were too many to save, too little time. He had misjudged everything. He had led them into a fight they were never meant to win. Desperation wrapped around his chest. There was only one path left. Arthur steadied his breathing and closed his eyes, diving inward, deep into the core of his being. Somewhere inside him lay the power Sylvia had left behind, the dragon's will, the gift that had changed his life. Memories surged. Training in El Anwar, pain beyond endurance, breakthroughs that stunned even General Varian. He remembered the first one, the first phase acquired. That state granted Arthur the ability to momentarily slip free from the normal flow of time and space, buying him a handful of priceless seconds to act while the world lagged behind him. But the cost was brutal. Each use tore at his mana core and ravaged his body from the inside, leaving damage that stacked with terrifying speed. It was never meant to be used repeatedly. The first phase alone was already dangerous. The second was something else entirely. Arthur's second breakthrough had baffled even the greatest minds. General Varian himself had spent decades chasing it, convinced it bordered on myth. Yet Arthur had accomplished it in barely over 2 years of relentless, near-lethal training. He had crossed a threshold no one else had managed. Phase 2, Dragon's Awakening. The words slipped from Arthur's cracked lips like a final vow. The change was immediate and violent. Golden runes ignited across his skin, searing themselves into his arms, shoulders, and back like living brands. They pulsed with blinding light, flowing in intricate draconic patterns that looked more carved than drawn. His auburn hair bleached into radiant white, lifting and flowing as if suspended in an unseen current. Power poured out of him in waves, heavy and ancient. This wasn't ordinary mana, it was primal, draconic. Arthur felt his body changing, bones reinforcing, senses sharpening beyond human limits. His heartbeat thundered like a war drum. For a fleeting moment, he felt closer to Sylvia than ever before, his existence tilting away from humanity and toward something far older and more fearsome. The surge rippled across vast distances. Far away, Sylvie felt it. The sudden, overwhelming spike of power struck her like a blade to the chest. Panic flooded her thoughts as she reached for Arthur instinctively, her mind screaming his name. He felt her immediately. and forced himself to respond, despite the strain. He begged her to stay away. Arthur knew the truth. He didn't know if he would survive what he was about to do. And if he fell, someone had to live. Someone had to return. Someone had to tell his family to keep going. After a painful hesitation, Sylvie obeyed. Her presence faded, leaving behind an aching silence in his mind. Arthur opened his eyes. Only two people remained standing behind him, Jasmine and Elijah. Everyone else was gone, slain, consumed, or betrayed. The battlefield was littered with loss. The Elderwood Guardian turned its attention fully toward him. Not Jasmine, not Elijah. Arthur alone. Its massive form radiated awareness now, no longer mindless. It understood that the true threat stood before it. Arthur met its gaze without fear. He accepted the challenge. With a violent burst of compressed air beneath his feet, Arthur launched himself skyward. The world slowed instantly. Sounds stretched, movements blurred. Each heartbeat echoed endlessly in his ears. He whispered the name of his most dangerous spell, White Fire. Flames ignited around his hands, but they weren't red or orange. They burned with a blinding white radiance, so intense they froze the moisture in the air around them. Frost bloomed where the fire passed. It was heat, so absolute it inverted reality itself. The spell screamed instability. Arthur absorbed every trace of water-respected mana from the environment, draining the air dry. His mana core screamed in protest. Pain lanced through his veins, but he didn't stop. He invoked his final technique, Absolute Zero. The Elderwood Guardian surged forward, its body a tidal wave of twisting vines, but it was too late. The white flames made contact, and the transformation was instantaneous. The vines didn't burn, they froze. Not surface deep, not layered in ice. They were locked down to the atomic level, every particle immobilized in perfect stillness. The colossal creature began crystallizing, turning into a massive sculpture of white-blue crystal, shimmering like a frozen monument. Arthur wasn't finished. He drew upon the last remnants of Sylvia's dormant will. The dam broke. Power erupted from his mana core in an uncontrollable torrent. The world drained of color, everything fading into grayscale, except the mana itself. Countless particles filled the air, glowing softly in their elemental hues. Fire, water, earth, wind, lightning. They all bent toward Arthur. The world wasn't resisting him anymore. It was responding. Mana surged violently through his body, tearing through his pores, flooding him faster than he could control. Space warped around him. The air distorted. Arthur gasped as the realization hit him. The world wasn't just reacting, it was obeying. Arthur moved. He wove through the frozen structure with terrifying speed, his blade coated in black lightning. Each strike carved through the Guardian's body with surgical precision. Wherever the lightning touched, vines disintegrated into ash instantly. He released the electricity outward. Black lightning exploded through the frozen mass. The crystal shattered. Thousands upon thousands of glittering fragments burst into the air, dissolving into nothing as the Elderwood Guardian's enormous body collapsed completely. The power left Arthur all at once. Dragon's awakening faded. His body gave out. Blood spilled from his mouth as he lost control midair, his strength evaporating. As he fell, his blurred vision caught the last remnants of the battlefield, the drifting crystal shards, sparkling softly like snow caught in moonlight. It was hauntingly beautiful. Just before darkness claimed him, a distant voice reached his ears. Sylvie, calling his name. Then everything went black. Far away in the quiet city of Zyra, peace reigned, unaware of the catastrophe unfolding elsewhere. Inside their home, Alice and Reynolds watched over Ellie, who had once again exhausted herself from training. Alice let out a weary sigh, equal parts amused and worried. Ellie was still young, far too young. Yet she pushed herself relentlessly, especially after Lilia's awakening. Reynolds chuckled softly as he tucked Ellie into bed, recognizing that stubborn determination all too well. He saw himself in her. Alice didn't smile. That same persistence. It reminded her too much of Reynolds during the war. As Reynolds straightened, something felt wrong. His heartbeat skipped. His eyes snapped to Alice, then to the ring on her finger. The ring Arthur had left behind was glowing. A soft pulsing light spilled into the room, heavy and ominous. The air felt dense, as if time itself had slowed. Alice froze. Her breath caught as dread flooded her chest. She whispered a denial, even as her hands trembled. The ring wasn't malfunctioning. She knew what it meant. Something had happened to Arthur. The house fell silent, thick, suffocating, and filled with unspoken fear. Arthur woke up and instantly wished he hadn't. Pain slammed into him like a personal vendetta. Every nerve screamed at once, locking his body in place. Tears rolled down his face, not because he was emotional, but because his body was actively trying to delete itself. He couldn't even scream. The agony was so overwhelming that forming a single thought felt like a luxury. All he could do was curse silently and pray the pain would chill out for even 1 second. A voice called his name. Elijah's. Arthur didn't answer. Staying conscious was already a full-time job. After what felt like an eternity, Arthur forced a few broken words out of his shredded throat, asking for his glove. His voice came out wrecked, blood filling his mouth until he had to turn his head just to avoid choking. Gritting through it, he told Elijah to break one of the crystals embedded in the glove and activate it. Elijah didn't hesitate. The moment the crystal shattered, a soft warmth spread over Arthur's ruined body. The magic didn't fix him, but it dulled the pain enough that breathing stopped feeling like torture. His limbs were still useless, heavy and numb, but at least his mind could function again. And that's when the memories hit. The explosion, the fire spell, being thrown like a ragdoll. At first it was blurry, but then the image sharpened. Someone running, someone holding his staff. Rage ignited in his chest. Lucas Wykes. That bastard had done this. Arthur strained to speak again and asked about Jasmine. His eyes scanned the dim shed they were hiding in. Elijah pointed toward the corner. Jasmine lay there, completely still. Elijah explained that she had taken the attack head-on. Unlike Arthur, she hadn't reinforced her body with mana. He'd treated her burns with a medical kit, but internal damage was still a real concern. Arthur didn't even think twice. Despite barely being held together himself, he told Elijah to take another healing gem from his glove and use it on her. Again, Elijah didn't question it. The crystal activated, flooding the cramped shelter with gentle light. Slowly, Jasmine's breathing steadied. The sharp, painful gasps faded into something calm and regular. Elijah reassured Arthur that she would recover with rest. Relief finally broke through the exhaustion. Once again, his mother's healing beads had saved them. As his body rested, Arthur closed his eyes and reached out through the bond he shared with Sylvie. The connection flared instantly, flooded with emotion. She had felt him wake up. She had been waiting, worried out of her mind. Arthur reassured her, told her he was safe now, and asked where she was. Reluctantly, she admitted she had followed his last order and stayed away from the danger. Arthur felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. He told her the immediate threat had passed and that she needed to focus on her training. Sylvie protested immediately, insisting that staying with him mattered more. But even through the emotional pushback, Arthur could feel it. Whatever she was doing right now was important. He urged her to trust him. Reluctantly, she agreed. As her presence faded, Arthur knew she would follow through. Elijah broke the silence, asking if Arthur felt any better. Arthur replied dryly that he felt ready to run a marathon. Elijah laughed, easing the tension just a little. After a pause, Elijah admitted something that had been bothering him. He never would have guessed that the masked swordsman he once tested was actually someone his own age. Arthur instinctively reached for his face. Bare skin. The mask was gone. Elijah explained it probably fell off during the fight and that he couldn't find it afterward. Arthur nodded, forcing himself to let it go. There were bigger problems. Then another thought hit him. His sword. He asked about the black blade he always carried. Elijah pointed nearby, where it had been set aside safely. He admitted he didn't know how valuable it was, but something about it made him keep it. Relief washed over Arthur instantly. That sword was more than a weapon. It was a piece of him. Arthur thanked Elijah sincerely, not just for treating Jasmine, but for staying behind when he could have escaped. Elijah brushed it off, saying he refused to be the kind of person who abandons others like Lucas did. Arthur chuckled weakly and corrected him. Not even close. Silence settled again. Elijah's thoughts drifted back to the Elderwood Guardian. He remembered Jasmine begging Arthur to retreat, and Arthur refusing. Finally, Elijah asked why. Arthur smiled faintly. In his mind, running had never been an option. A king didn't abandon his people. But deeper than pride or duty was Sylvie, her faith in him. The promise he made to grow stronger and protect those around him. That promise had kept him standing. Elijah laughed, calling him an old man for sounding so serious. Arthur didn't argue. Sometimes he wondered how he even ended up like this. To change the subject, Arthur asked how long he'd been out. More than a day, Elijah said. Arthur groaned softly, leaning back against the wall, as the dull pain reminded him of his limits. They'd be stuck there a while longer until Jasmine recovered. With a small smile, Arthur suggested they use the time to actually talk. He extended his hand and introduced himself properly. His name was Arthur Leywin. Friends could call him Art. Elijah shook his hand with pride and introduced himself properly. Elijah Knight of Darv. The name carried weight, and he clearly knew it. Arthur glanced around the small stone shelter they were hiding in. It was too clean, too smooth, too stable. This wasn't some lucky cave formation. He tapped the wall with a knuckle and asked Elijah straight up where this place came from. Elijah admitted he had made it himself just before the cavern collapsed. Apparently, the Elderwood Guardian's massive body had been acting like structural support. Once it went down, the entire cave followed. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Even for a deviant, that explanation didn't add up. You couldn't just conjure metal out of thin air. You could shape it, manipulate it, move it, but creation? That was impossible. Unless you were a dwarf. Arthur said it casually like it was obvious. Elijah froze, then gave a sheepish smile. So much for keeping that secret. Arthur chuckled, understanding that secrets don't last long when you're trapped together and bleeding out. Still, Elijah wasn't about to give everything away for free. He proposed a trade. He'd explain his abilities, but only if Arthur explained what happened during the fight. Elijah had seen it. The white hair, the glowing symbols, the violet eyes. That wasn't normal. That wasn't anything he'd ever seen before. Arthur looked down for a moment, then nodded. Fair was fair. Elijah had earned the truth. Elijah took a breath and began his story. He confirmed Arthur's suspicion. Yes, he was raised in Darv, but he didn't actually know where he came from. Elder Radeus, the man who raised him, had always dodged questions about Elijah's parents. Every attempt to remember his early childhood only brought flashes. Disconnected images, pain. For most of his life, things felt normal. That changed the moment he advanced to the dark orange stage. Something inside him exploded. He blacked out. When he woke up, he was surrounded by black metal spikes. Metal he instinctively knew he had created. Not shaped, created. After that, Elder Radius told him it was time to leave and explore the lands of Dikathen. No explanation, no warning, just gone. Even now, Elijah admitted there was something inside him that never rested, a constant itch beneath his skin, tied to his powers, tied to his origin, something unfinished. Arthur noticed Elijah's hands shaking slightly. The boy clenched them into fists, trying to hide it. Before Arthur could respond, the silence was shattered by a loud, awkward sound, snoring. Jasmine was still unconscious and absolutely sawing logs. Her head rolled to the side as she muttered something about fish and Arthur tasting similar. Both boys lost it. Laughter echoed inside the shelter, cutting through the tension like a blade. Elijah apologized quickly, saying he didn't mean to drop an emotional bomb like that. Arthur waved it off. They'd both earned honesty. Now it was his turn. Arthur explained calmly what he was. A quadra-elemental augmenter. 4 elements. On top of that, 2 deviances. Ice and lightning. Elijah tried to sit up too fast and slammed his head into the low ceiling. Groaning, he muttered that if Arthur was a freak, then he himself must be the king of freaks. But Elijah wasn't done. He asked about the markings, the hair, the eyes. Arthur revealed the last piece. He was also a beast tamer. What Elijah had seen was his beast will, released, the sign of a bond with a powerful magical beast. Elijah just stared. Then he asked the real question. How old are you? Arthur answered simply, 11. Just turned a few months ago. Elijah blinked, then muttered that he was almost 12. Somehow, standing next to Arthur made him feel younger than ever. Hours passed. The two sat inside the metal shelter, talking, really talking, about their pasts, their fears, their abilities, their hopes. What started as survival turned into kinship. Then Arthur's breath hitched. A sharp pain stabbed through his core. He reached for his glove and pulled out another healing gem. Elijah noticed immediately, concern flashing across his face. Arthur brushed it off. As the final crystal shattered, warm energy spread through his body, dulling the deep pulsing pain. That's when Jasmine stirred. The moment she saw Arthur awake, she surged forward and wrapped her arms around him. Arthur barely had time to react before he felt something wet against his neck. Tears. Her body shook as she cried, apologizing over and over, blaming herself, saying she failed him. Arthur gently placed a hand on her head, telling her it was okay, that there was nothing to forgive. Still, she couldn't stop. So Arthur told her the truth. It was his decision. He stayed behind. The consequences were his to bear. If anything, he was sorry for dragging her into it. As she cried in his arms, Arthur saw her differently. She had always seemed larger than life, strong, unshakable. Now she felt small, human. When Jasmine finally calmed down, she turned to Elijah and asked about their belongings. He confirmed everything was safe. She told him about an emergency medical kit in her bag. Something that could help all of them. They got to work. Elijah retrieved the kit, and together the three of them prepared to patch themselves up. Alive, broken, but still standing. Working in silence, they tended to each other's wounds, carefully wrapping torn skin and bruised limbs. The healing gems had already dulled the worst of the pain, but the bandages would help stabilize their injuries for the journey ahead. Arthur offered a quiet word of thanks to both of them. Though the ache still pulsed deep within his body, he genuinely felt stronger, strong enough to stand. With effort, Arthur pushed himself upright. He rested a hand on Jasmine's shoulder, then Elijah's, steadying himself as his legs protested. His voice, though tired, carried certainty. It was time to go home. Supporting Arthur between them, the three began their slow ascent, crawling and climbing through the broken remains of what had once been a fierce battlefield. They emerged from the deep crater carved into the earth, and the sight that greeted them was nothing short of devastating. The lush grassland that once filled the cavern was gone. Trees lay snapped and scattered like broken matchsticks. Massive stalactites had fallen from above, smashing into the ground and leaving deep fractures across the terrain. The earth itself looked torn open, as if nature had been ripped apart by brute force. Arthur scanned the destruction and asked the question none of them wanted to answer. Had anyone else survived? Elijah's response was grim. Reginald and Broad had been devoured by the Elderwood Guardian before the true battle even began. There was little hope anyone else had made it out alive. Jasmine hesitated before softly asking about Samantha. Elijah fell silent for a moment before explaining that, just before the cavern collapsed, he had managed to form a metal shelter around her, but she had already been in terrible condition. Whether she had survived beneath the rubble? He didn't know. Arthur stared across the endless debris, his expression darkening. Searching for someone, anyone in this sea of destruction felt impossible. Even the Elderwood Guardian's beast core, a treasure of immense value, was likely buried far beneath their feet, lost forever under stone and ruin. Still, Elijah refused to give up. He hadn't been able to search properly while trapped underground, But now that they were free, he was willing to try. Kneeling, he pressed his palm against the fractured earth. Mana rippled outward as he whispered the spell. Earth pulse. The air grew tense. Jasmine stood quietly beside Arthur, watching Elijah with unblinking focus. Minutes passed as Elijah concentrated, listening to vibrations far below the surface. Then his eyes widened, first in shock, then relief. He had found her. Samantha was alive. Her heart was still beating. Arthur felt a flicker of surprise. Earth pulse was meant for surface-level detection, yet Elijah had sensed someone buried deep beneath the rubble. The question returned once more. Just who was Elijah Knight, really? Without delay, they followed him across the shattered battlefield. As they neared a cluster of collapsed stone and fallen stalactites, Elijah murmured another incantation. Metal surged upward, smoothly forming a protective enclosure. Inside lay Samantha. She was unconscious, her body battered and broken. Her legs were twisted at unnatural angles, clearly shattered. Elijah's face twisted in horror as he rushed forward, but Arthur stopped him. One of the Elderwood Guardian's thick, withered vines was still wrapped tightly around her leg, not strangling her, but acting as a crude splint. Removing it now could make things worse. Arthur pointed out the signs. Her breathing was steady. Her pulse was strong, though she burned with fever. As bad as it looked, her life wasn't in immediate danger. Unconsciousness, for now, was sparing her from unbearable pain. Elijah clenched his fists, muttering bitterly under his breath. They had paid a heavy price to get this far. Jasmine gently lifted Samantha into her arms, cradling her carefully. She looked to Arthur and quietly asked if they should leave. Arthur's gaze drifted back to the ruined battlefield. The Beast Corps was gone, the victory incomplete, but they were alive, and that had to be enough. Before he could answer, a thunderous roar shook the cavern. The ground trembled violently, and loose stone rained from above. Elijah groaned, exhaustion etched deep into his face. But Arthur remained calm. The massive stone doors Lucas had sealed behind them suddenly exploded inward. Rock shattered, dust filled the air, and as it cleared, Elijah stood frozen in disbelief, while Jasmine released a breath of pure relief. Standing in the doorway was Sylvie. But she was no longer the small, playful companion Arthur remembered. Her body had grown into something magnificent and terrifying. Sleek scales, powerful limbs, and the unmistakable form of a dragon. The name Arthur had once given her now fit perfectly. Her voice echoed in his mind, filled with emotion. She had come back for him. Arthur let out a low whistle, stunned. Sylvie wasn't just bigger, she was massive. Before he could say another word, she lunged forward and licked his face with her long, snake-like tongue, nearly knocking him off his feet. He staggered back, gagging at her breath, yet smiling all the same as her laughter rang through his thoughts. Elijah could only stare, stammering, his mind completely unable to process what he was witnessing. The creature standing before them was wrong in the best possible way. It had 4 fully formed limbs, nothing like a wyvern. Elijah's throat tightened as the word struggled to escape his mouth. His voice shook when he tried to say it, but Arthur spared him the effort. She's a dragon. The word landed like a death sentence to common sense. Elijah looked around the cavern as if anyone, was about to laugh and explain the trick. No one did. There was no explanation to be found. Dragons were supposed to be gone, erased from history, reduced to myths, whispered in dusty tomes. And yet one stood here now, massive, breathing, very real, and bonded to a boy who hadn't even lived a dozen years. Arthur rested a hand against Sylvie's scaled snout. The dragon leaned into his touch, her massive form softening instantly. Her hind leg thumped against the stone in an almost ridiculous rhythm, like a loyal beast responding to praise rather than a creature of extinction-level legend. Arthur introduced her calmly, as if this was normal. Sylvie, his bond, his partner, his closest companion. Elijah's mind refused to keep up. 11 years old, quadra-elemental, 2 deviances, beast tamer, and now this. Arthur spoke again, quieter this time. The truth was his, but it came with a condition. No one else could know. Jasmine already did. Now Elijah did too. And that was where it ended. Dragons didn't survive the world by being known. Sylvie turned her attention to Jasmine next. Before anyone could react, the dragon leaned down and dragged her tongue across Jasmine's face in a single wet motion. Jasmine recoiled with a groan, saliva dripping as she wiped her face in disbelief. Elijah stared, muttering under his breath, overwhelmed by how absurd and terrifying this reality had become. There was no time to process it. They needed to move. With practiced care, Jasmine and Elijah lifted Samantha's broken body and settled her onto Sylvie's broad back. Arthur followed, his strength still fragile, his movements slow and deliberate. Every breath felt earned. Elijah hesitated, staring at the scene like it might vanish if he blinked. Arthur called to him again. It was time to go. Sylvie didn't hesitate. Her wings unfurled, massive enough to blot out the cavern light, and then she launched upward. The wind screamed as stone and dust were left behind. The dungeon that had nearly buried them alive shrank beneath them, its suffocating grip broken. What had taken them a full day to descend took only hours to escape. When Sylvie landed near the upper levels, the cavern wasn't empty. The bat runners were still there. Leathery wings twitched, noses flared. The moment they sensed new arrivals, their bodies tensed, screeching in unison as they surged forward. Jasmine drew her blade instantly, muscles coiled to strike. Then they saw Sylvie. The change was immediate. The bat runners skidded to a halt, claws scraping against stone. Their screeches warped into panic as instinct crushed whatever courage they had. One by one, they turned and fled into the darkness, vanishing as fast as they could. Silence followed. Jasmine stood frozen, sword still raised. Elijah swallowed hard. They finally understood. It wasn't them the monsters feared. It was her. With the threat gone, they carefully helped Arthur down. Samantha was lowered next. Her battered body laid gently against the cold stone. Arthur followed clumsily, pain flaring through every joint. Samantha stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, and when she saw Arthur, her cracked lips curved faintly. Her voice came out hoarse, barely holding together. "You look better without the mask." Arthur told her to stop talking, to save her strength. She ignored him. With shaking hands, she reached into her robe and pulled something free. In one palm lay Arthur's mask. In the other, Elijah's breath caught. The Elderwood Guardian's beast core. Even on the brink of death, she had taken it. Arthur accepted it slowly, staring at the dull green stone veined with gray patterns, mana humming quietly inside. He said they would sell it and split the reward evenly. Both Jasmine and Elijah refused immediately. No hesitation, no discussion. Arthur protested, confused, but the answer didn't change. Samantha spoke softly, barely above a whisper. She was alive. That was enough. Arthur had killed the beast. The reward belonged to him. Arthur looked down at the core once more, then nodded. He told them to head to the guild hall and bring help. He would stay behind with Samantha. They agreed instantly. Before leaving, Elijah handed over Arthur's belongings, just in case. Then they were gone. Arthur was left alone in the ruined cavern. After a moment, he reached into his pack. His fingers brushed against thin parchment. Sound transmission scrolls. Relief washed over him. His mana had recovered just enough. He recorded a short message. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. Just proof that he was alive. The scroll shimmered and vanished, carrying his voice away. It wasn't much, but at least for now, his family wouldn't be left in the dark. Arthur turned his gaze toward Sylvie. She stood beside him, utterly still, yet radiating presence. Even at rest, she felt overwhelming, like a calamity choosing to sleep. Arthur asked her the question that had been burning in the back of his mind since she tore through the cavern like a living legend. How had she grown so much? How had she changed so drastically? Her answer flowed through their bond, clear and unfiltered. She had hunted mana beasts, strong ones, dangerous ones. She had fought, devoured, and absorbed their cores, stacking power upon power in brutal silence. No shortcuts, no mercy, just survival and growth. At Arthur's request, Sylvie began to shift. Her massive form shimmered, glowing faintly as her body compressed in on itself. Bone, muscle, and mana folded smoothly until the towering dragon was gone. In her place sat a much smaller creature, one Arthur knew well. But she wasn't the same. The playful red spikes were gone. Her fur was pitch black, swallowing the light around her. Her yellow eyes were sharper now, intelligent in a way that felt almost unsettling. She looked less like a cute companion and more like a little demon born from shadows. Still, she was Sylvie. Arthur let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He then pulled out the Elderwood Guardian's beast core. The stone pulsed faintly in his palm, dense with power, humming like a restrained heartbeat. Jasmine and Elijah wouldn't be back immediately. He had time, and wasting time was something he couldn't afford anymore. With his body's unique ability to assimilate mana, this core would accelerate his recovery dramatically. Arthur sat down, crossed his legs, and closed his eyes. Meditation. The moment he drew the mana in, warmth spread through his limbs, flowing through damaged channels, stitching strength back into him piece by piece. His body welcomed the energy like a starving beast, but his mind didn't rest. Lucas Wykes. The name surfaced like poison. Lucas had left them to die. No hesitation, no remorse. Because of him, Brauld was dead. Samantha was barely clinging to life. Blood stained that dungeon long before the Elderwood Guardian ever fell. And Lucas wasn't just some reckless noble brat. He was a Wykes, a name that carried weight, power, protection. Arthur knew better than to rush this. Charging in blindly would only end with more people hurt, or worse. Revenge wasn't enough. Not the shallow kind, not a momentary release of rage. What Lucas had done demanded something heavier, something permanent. His thoughts were cut short by approaching footsteps. Arthur opened his eyes. A group in uniform entered the cavern. Medics, sent by Jasmine and Elijah. They moved fast, efficient, professional. Herbal anesthetics were administered, hands steady as they stabilized Samantha and secured her onto a stretcher. She was alive. Barely, but alive. They recovered Brauld's body next, carefully, respectfully. Outside, waiting beyond the dungeon entrance, were Brauld's wife and child. The moment they saw him, they collapsed. The sound of grief filled the hall, raw, broken cries that dug straight into the chest. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was real. Later, Arthur, Jasmine, and Elijah were escorted to the guild hall, to a private chamber, Caspian's office. The air was heavy with tension and exhaustion. Elijah spoke first, recounting everything. The Guardian, the traps, the collapse, and Lucas's betrayal. Nothing was spared. Every detail was dragged into the open. And with each word, the weight of it all pressed down harder. Arthur finally spoke, his voice calm, but edged with fatigue. They had already given their statements. The dungeon, the battle, the betrayal. How much more was needed? For him, it was enough. Caspian agreed. He saw it in their faces. He told them they would rest before the official hearing. Then the doors exploded open. Armored guards stormed in. Every eye turned. The symbol of House Wykes gleamed on their uniforms. And at the center of it all, Lucas Wykes. He walked in smiling. Like this was a reunion. Like they'd just returned from a casual outing instead of a massacre. His tone was light, mocking, pretending concern. Jasmine's blades were out instantly, metal flashing. Elijah's mana surged, sparks forming at his fingertips. Both of them were shaking, teeth clenched so hard it looked painful. Arthur raised a hand, calmly. Stand down. They hesitated, but obeyed. Lucas feigned confusion, playing dumb, acting as though he couldn't understand why anyone would be upset. Caspian watched Arthur closely, silently asking him to hold back. Arthur didn't move, didn't speak. Then Lucas crossed the line. He joked about survival, about sacrifices, about whether someone had to be thrown away so the rest could escape. Caspian stood abruptly, trying to shut it down. Lucas ignored him. He turned to Samantha, sneering, calling her a cripple. Then he smirked and started talking about Brauld, implying Arthur might have used him like a shield. He never finished. A blade screamed through the air. It slammed into the door behind Lucas with brutal force. After slicing clean through his ear, blood sprayed across the floor. One of the guards shouted in panic, pointing at the wound. Lucas froze. His hand rose slowly to his ear. When he pulled it back, it was soaked in red. Not fatal, but humiliating enough. Arthur stood, slowly and deliberately. His eyes locked onto Lucas. Not with rage, but with something far worse, cold intent. Bloodlust flooded the room like a tidal wave. The air grew heavy, suffocating. Guards stumbled, breath hitching as invisible pressure crushed down on them. Their limbs felt weighed in iron. Fear replaced confusion. Lucas screamed at them to move. They charged, shields up, swords raised. To Arthur, they were slow, predictable, and utterly insignificant. Time itself seemed to crawl, like the world had dipped into thick syrup the moment the guards moved. Arthur reacted first. With terrifying precision, he intercepted the leading guard's strike, steel meeting steel in a sharp, ringing clash. In the same motion, Arthur twisted his wrist and drove his blade down into the man's elbow. Bone cracked. The impact was savage. The guard was launched backward like dead weight, slamming into the floor with a choked groan and not getting back up. Arthur didn't pause, not even for a breath. He flowed forward, movement smooth and ruthless, like a storm given shape. The next two guards charged together, shouting, desperate to overwhelm him with numbers. Arthur's sword flashed, one clean arc. The air screamed. Their momentum betrayed them as they collided with each other mid-charge and crashed to the stone floor in a tangled heap, armor clanging uselessly. Only one guard remained. The man swore under his breath, fear bleeding through his anger. He raised his sword overhead and brought it down with everything he had left. But Arthur was already gone. The blade cut nothing but air. Arthur passed him in a blur, calm and effortless, leaving the guard standing there in stunned silence before his knees buckled and he collapsed, unconscious, without ever realizing when he'd lost. Caspian shouted then, sharp and urgent, ordering Arthur to stop. Any violence before the hearing would complicate things, make them worse, dangerous. Arthur didn't acknowledge him. He walked straight toward Lucas. But instead of finishing it, Arthur reached out calmly and grasped the hilt of his blade still buried in the door behind Lucas. His expression didn't change as he pulled it free. It slipped, Arthur said flatly. I was just retrieving it. Lucas couldn't move. Blood dripped steadily from his severed ear, pattering softly against the floor. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The smug confidence he'd walked in with was gone, replaced by raw, animal fear. He finally understood something he should have realized much earlier. He was standing in front of a monster. Caspian forced himself back into control and turned sharply to one of the officers, Lydia, instructing her to escort Lucas to the medical ward immediately. The guards didn't waste a second. Arthur turned then, addressing Jasmine and Elijah. He told them to wait outside. They didn't argue. They nodded once and left the room. Arthur closed the door behind them. Now, it was just him and Caspian. Caspian exhaled slowly, the tension still thick enough to choke on. He tried to reason with Arthur, warning him not to provoke Lucas again. No matter what had happened, Lucas was a Wykes. Acting openly against someone like that carried consequences far beyond a single room. Arthur didn't appreciate the warning. His response was cold, almost bored. He said plainly that if he wanted Lucas erased, he could do it, that the identity he hid behind, the masked swordsman, note, shielded him. The implication hung in the air like a drawn blade. Arthur stepped closer. The pressure in the room intensified again, sharp and suffocating. Caspian felt it immediately. Not just mana, but something heavier, experience, death. These weren't the eyes of an 11-year-old boy. They were the eyes of someone who had killed. Caspian didn't back down. He told Arthur he wasn't threatening him. He was protecting him. The Wykes family didn't play fair. If Arthur killed Lucas, the retaliation wouldn't stop with him. Jasmine would be targeted. The twin horns, past and present, would be hunted. Anyone connected to Arthur would be dragged into it. His message was simple. Wait, until Arthur was strong enough to protect everything he cared about. Until he could stand against even Lucas's half-brother. Raw power alone wasn't enough yet. Arthur listened. Then he nodded once. He thanked Caspian for the warning, acknowledging it for what it was. But there was another reason he'd asked for privacy. And now, it was time to address that. Arthur walked past Caspian and sat down across from him. Relaxed, composed. When he spoke, his tone carried certainty, not arrogance. He reminded Caspian that a man in his position understood value. And aligning with someone like Arthur wasn't charity. It was an investment. Supporting him would benefit the Adventurers Guild itself. Caspian didn't smile openly, but amusement flickered behind his eyes. He wasn't sure whether Arthur's confidence came from youth or something far deeper, but either way, it was unsettling. Caspian agreed. As long as it was within the Guild's power, they would support Arthur. Arthur nodded and laid out his demands calmly. After a brief discussion, he stood and left the room. The hallway outside was quiet. Elijah was waiting, tense and pale. The moment Arthur appeared, he spoke, admitting honestly that he'd been terrified. Genuinely afraid Arthur would have killed Lucas right there. Arthur shrugged it off. It wasn't time. Elijah hesitated, then asked the question he probably shouldn't have. Did Arthur still intend to kill Lucas someday? Arthur didn't answer. Instead, he changed the subject, saying he was starving and Sylvie was waiting. They should eat before the hearing. The conversation was over. Elijah nodded, unsettled. Justice had to come next. The guild arranged a formal hearing in a small amphitheater-style courtroom. Arthur sat on one side, Lucas on the other. Between them sat a panel of elderly robed judges, respected figures within the guild, flipping silently through records and testimonies. The tension was suffocating. Finally, the tallest judge stood and delivered the verdict. Lucas Wykes was stripped of his A-class rank for sabotage and endangering fellow adventurers during an official dungeon expedition. He was banned from re-enlisting until further notice. Lucas handed over his enchanted identification card without protest. The punishment settled heavily over the room. Arthur watched in silence. For everything Lucas had done, leaving them to die, triggering the collapse, getting people killed, this was all. Anyone else would have been imprisoned, executed even. But Lucas was a Wykes. Then the judge turned to Arthur. He was asked to stand. The panel had reached a decision regarding him as well. Despite his heroics, despite the lives saved, Arthur was to be punished for his public display of aggression toward Lucas. The ruling was blunt. The verdict came down hard. Arthur was officially banned from entering Xyrus City for as long as Lucas Wykes remained enrolled at Xyrus Academy. The gavel struck. Once, clean, final. The sound echoed through the chamber, like a coffin nail being driven in, sealing the outcome in stone. Arthur had expected it, had even planned for it. But he still leaned forward at the podium, jaw tightening as he raised his voice in protest. He demanded to know how any of this made sense, how the one who had been betrayed, nearly killed, was the one being punished while the traitor walked free. His tone carried heat, anger, injustice, but it was theater. Out of the corner of his eye, Arthur caught it. The exact moment Lucas's stiff posture loosened, the exact second relief crept into his expression and curled into a smug, self-satisfied grin. That grin told Arthur everything he needed to know. Good. Let him think he'd won. The judge silenced Arthur with a sharp rap of his staff. The guild, he explained, had taken the full context into account. That was precisely why Arthur's adventurer license hadn't been revoked. He was free to continue working, free to take missions, free to grow stronger. But there was one rule. Arthur was to stay away from Lucas Wykes and the Wykes family. No contact, no provocation, no exceptions. Then Lucas opened his mouth. Panic cracked through his voice as he demanded to know Arthur's true identity. Who was he really? What guarantee did they have that Arthur wouldn't sneak into Xyrus City unmasked and slaughter his family in their sleep? Coward. One of the judges answered coldly with final authority. Arthur's real identity would be recorded and sealed within the guild's highest records. Lucas and the Wykes family would never be informed. A select group of guild mages would monitor Arthur at all times, masked or not, to prevent escalation. Lucas tried to argue again. The judges didn't even look at him. The decision was final. Guards moved in, surrounding Lucas and his entourage. The judges stood, signaling the end of the hearing. The chamber slowly emptied, voices low, tension still clinging to the air like smoke after a fire. Lucas, however, couldn't leave without one last attempt at dominance. He turned back, eyes sharp, posture stiff with false bravado. His voice cut through the room as he warned Arthur to keep his distance if he valued his life. Arthur didn't blink. He met Lucas's gaze calmly, almost lazily, and replied with words that were soft, but sharp enough to draw blood. He made it very clear that Lucas's threats meant nothing. That distance was a courtesy, not a necessity. For just a heartbeat, the fear surfaced again in Lucas's eyes. Then he backed away. Silence was safer. Arthur watched him disappear through the massive doors, his expression unreadable. A guard approached Arthur to escort him out, but before he could speak, one of the judges intervened, dismissing the guard politely. He gestured toward a narrow door hidden behind the raised desk and offered to guide Arthur himself. They passed into a quiet hallway, sealed away from the rest of the courthouse. As they walked, the judge finally spoke. He asked whether the outcome, staged as it was, had been satisfactory. Arthur nodded. Everything had unfolded exactly as intended. Lucas had been humiliated publicly, stripped of rank, and left paranoid. Arthur's identity remained buried, for now. The judge clarified that this protection wasn't charity. It was strategy, delaying retaliation from the Wykes family was in everyone's interest. Eventually, the truth would surface. But if Arthur didn't move openly, perhaps the Wykes wouldn't either. Arthur laughed quietly, assuring the judge he wasn't reckless. He knew when to wait. They stopped at a tall shelf lined with ancient tomes. The judge pressed one book inward. Stones shifted. The floor opened, revealing a stairway descending into darkness. Before Arthur stepped down, the judge left him with a final warning. One day, the guild might call in this favor. When that day came, he hoped Arthur would remember who had shielded him today. Arthur gave a half smile. The guild wasn't weak. They were just careful. He descended the stairs. The entrance sealed behind him. Left alone, the judge stared at the hidden passage, a single thought echoing in his mind. Caspian was right. Arthur Leywin wasn't just dangerous. He was inevitable. When Arthur emerged from the hidden exit, he barely had time to breathe before a familiar force slammed into his stomach. Sylvie. She tackled him head first. Full speed, knocking the air from his lungs. Arthur winced, clutching his side as she chirped happily and scrambled up to her favorite spot atop his head. Her voice echoed in his mind, bright and impatient, asking if it was finally over, if they could go home now. Outside, Jasmine and Elijah were waiting. Relief was written plainly across their faces. Arthur gave them a simple nod. It was done. The trial, the confrontation, the chaos, it was finished. As they walked toward the teleportation gate beyond the beast glades, Elijah brought up Samantha, asking if Arthur planned to visit her. Arthur paused, then shook his head. It was better if he didn't. Jasmine could check on her when she recovered. Jasmine nodded quietly, understanding without words. The walk grew quieter, heavier. Elijah mentioned that they'd be parting ways soon. Arthur stopped. He remembered something. Elijah wasn't from Sapin. He had nowhere to stay. So Arthur casually suggested Elijah come live with his family for a while, at least until school started. Elijah blinked, confused. School? Arthur started explaining, only for Elijah to cut him off, annoyed. Of course he knew what school was. He just hadn't planned on attending one. Arthur smirked and reminded him of his goal, to make a name for himself. If that ambition was real, then Xyrus Academy was the path forward. Elijah scoffed. Getting in required money, influence, things he didn't have. Arthur grinned and pulled him into a quick side hug. "Leave that part to your big brother," he said. "Just show up." Elijah protested immediately, pointing out that he was older. But the moment had already slipped out of his control. Arthur turned to Jasmine, calm and decisive, and asked if she could take Elijah home first. Elijah tried one last time to object. He hadn't agreed to anything yet, but Arthur's eyes glinted with quiet menace as he reminded him of one small detail. Lucas Wykes would be attending Xyrus Academy too. Was Elijah really comfortable leaving Arthur alone with someone like that? That ended the argument. As Jasmine and Elijah headed toward the teleportation gate, Elijah's mind was already racing ahead. He started muttering about classes, wondering aloud which paths would suit him best at Xyrus Academy. Then he slowed, turned back, and called out to Arthur. His voice was softer this time, honest, a simple thank you for everything. Arthur watched them disappear into the distance. Only when they were completely gone did the faint smile on his face fade away. A quiet sigh escaped him as his gaze drifted toward the surrounding woods. "Come out," Arthur said calmly. The air shifted. From between the trees, Caspian stepped forward, no longer hiding. His expression was composed, though there was caution in his eyes. He admitted it had been wise to send Jasmine and Elijah away first, just in case. Arthur nodded and thanked him for persuading the judge to follow through with the plan. It had worked. Lucas would remain ignorant, for now. Caspian exhaled in relief, saying he was simply glad it had all ended without anyone dying. Arthur's eyes sharpened. People died. The words landed heavily. Caspian stiffened, realizing his mistake, and quickly corrected himself. Clearing his throat, he changed the subject and tossed a small pouch toward Arthur. It landed softly in his hand. "A parting gift," Caspian said. Nothing more. Arthur loosened the drawstrings and froze. Gold spilled into his palm. Far more than he had ever held at once. For a moment, he was reminded of the boy he used to be, someone who had counted every copper. When Arthur asked why, Caspian answered simply, "Precautions. The road ahead wouldn't be safe." As Caspian turned and walked away, Arthur's thoughts churned. Precautions. Don's ballad wouldn't draw attention as long as he didn't use it. The real danger was Lucas. He had seen Sylvie's dragon form, and memories like that had a way of becoming weapons. As if responding to the thought, a soft glow appeared above Arthur's head. Sylvie's black scales shimmered, bleaching into radiant white. Her form shrank, twisted, softened, until a small, delicate white fox floated down into Arthur's arms. Through their bond, her sleepy voice asked if this form was better. Arthur stared, stunned, quietly wondering how many forms she could even take. Sylvie admitted she didn't know. She was tired. Before he could reply, she curled up against him and fell asleep. Arthur whispered a gentle goodnight, still in disbelief. Standing alone in the quiet woods, Arthur reflected. Having a dragon as a bond came with advantages, and he was only just beginning to understand them. Before using the teleportation gate, Arthur took care of a few unfinished matters. Making sure no one was watching, he slipped behind a tree, removed his mask and coat, and stored them away. He needed to disappear. The town buzzed with life. Adventurers in battered armor moved with urgency, while robed merchants shouted prices for dungeon loot and magical materials. Arthur blended into the crowd, unremarkable, unseen. His destination was a modest shop marked by an old wooden sign, Ekvius artifacts. Inside, the clerk offered a routine greeting until he noticed Arthur's age. Suspicion crept into his voice as he asked if Arthur was lost. Arthur calmly requested a small dimension ring, one that could fit over his thumb. The clerk scoffed. Even the smallest rings were costly. Arthur opened his sack. Gold gleamed. The man's skepticism vanished instantly. Arthur left with the ring in hand, the clerk still staring after him in disbelief. Most of his gold was gone now, spent on a ring barely large enough to store a sword and a beast core. It was worth it. He was preparing for a new life, at least on the surface. Arthur stepped through the teleportation gate and emerged in Xyrus, pausing to breathe in the familiar air. Home. He took a carriage toward the Helsty estate, passing the academy along the way. Xyrus Academy loomed in the distance, massive, imposing. He wondered what it would be like to walk those halls not as a fighter, not as a killer, but as a student. The carriage stopped at Helsty Manor. Arthur slipped inside quietly, careful not to disturb Sylvie. As he climbed the stairs, he stared at the mask in his hand. 2 years. 2 years of hiding behind it. Then, crash! The double doors slammed open. A small girl stood there, hands on her hips, radiating authority far beyond her size. Ellie. Arthur barely managed to say her name before she charged down the stairs and slammed into him, hugging him tightly. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered a simple welcome. She had missed him. Arthur smiled and promised her he wasn't leaving again. Satisfied, she giggled, ran back upstairs, and waved for him to follow. Arthur stood there, stunned. She'd grown so much. Last time, she'd been small, fragile, still unsure of the world, and of him. As that thought settled, something cold wrapped around Arthur's heart. A realization, a horrifying one. Ellie had grown. In a few short years, maybe even sooner, boys would start paying attention to her. That meant clumsy crushes, lingering teenage stares, and awkward attempts to get close to his little sister. The thought alone made Arthur's stomach churn. The image formed vividly in his mind. Ellie, who once clung to his arm with small hands, now surrounded by boys who didn't know their place. His eyes widened as his thoughts spiraled, imagining her growing up far too fast. He didn't like that future. He wasn't ready for it. Thankfully, that unsettling train of thought was cut short by a familiar voice calling out to him. Arthur! His mother, Alice, rushed in first, with Reynolds right behind her. The tension melted from their faces the moment they saw him, relief and joy softening their expressions. His father, still broad-shouldered and powerful despite the years, didn't hesitate for even a second. Reynolds scooped Arthur up with a loud laugh, pulling him into a crushing embrace that nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. With a proud grin, he joked that Arthur hadn't grown at all since he last saw him. Arthur shot back instantly, smirking as he pointed out his father's increasingly wild beard, accusing him of growing it out just to hide the wrinkles creeping in. The banter barely had time to escalate before Alice stepped in, lightly scolding Arthur while fiercely defending her husband. Then she wrapped Arthur in her own embrace, warm, steady, and grounding. This time, there were no tears, no reprimands. She simply told him how glad she was that he had come back safe. Arthur apologized quietly, guilt surfacing over how often he made them worry. Alice only smiled, brushing it aside as if it didn't matter. Off to the side, Vincent Helstea tried to insert himself into the reunion with his usual booming cheer. But before he could finish his greeting, Tabitha smacked the back of his head. This was a family moment, she reminded him sharply. Reynolds and Alice deserved this time with their son. Vincent rubbed his head sheepishly, backing off as the moment passed. Soon enough, everyone gathered together in the living area, settling in with relaxed smiles and light laughter. Arthur's eyes drifted around the room, instinctively searching. Alice noticed immediately and asked if he was looking for someone. Arthur admitted it felt like someone was missing. That was when Elijah stepped forward and handed him a folded piece of paper. Jasmine had already departed on another mission with the twin horns, but she'd left a note behind. Arthur unfolded it. It was brief, straightforward, and unmistakably Jasmine. No unnecessary words. Emotion tucked beneath practicality. Arthur smiled faintly. He'd wanted to see her before she left, but this would have to be enough. Reynolds laughed and remarked that the twin horns always returned eventually, like stubborn weeds that refused to die. Arthur chuckled along, but one more name lingered in his thoughts. He asked about Lilia. Tabitha began to explain, but Vincent cut in far too quickly, puffing his chest out, as he proudly announced that their daughter had been accepted into Xyrus Academy. His excitement drowned out Tabitha's words, earning him an immediate response. She grabbed a fistful of his hair and yanked it, scolding him for stealing her moment. Vincent yelped, and the room burst into laughter. Arthur was genuinely impressed. Being accepted into Xyrus Academy was no small feat. It was a major step forward, and a moment of pride for the Helstea family. Tabitha, her tone still sharp but sincere beneath it, reminded Arthur that it was thanks to him. Without his guidance, Lilia might never have unlocked her potential. The Helstes, she said firmly, would always owe him. Vincent nodded along enthusiastically, still rubbing his head, adding that a mage hadn't appeared in their family for generations. Arthur waved it off with a modest smile, saying he wasn't sure about being owed anything, but maybe, just maybe, he'd cash in a favor or two someday. That was when Reynolds could no longer contain himself. He stomped his foot, leaning forward eagerly. Now that everyone was accounted for, he wanted to hear everything. The dungeon, the fights, the adventure, all of it. Arthur smirked and began. His storytelling quickly drew everyone in, the living room of the Helstea Manor filling with gasping gasps, laughter, and stunned silence at the right moments. Arthur recounted most of the journey honestly, carefully omitting Lucas's betrayal. His family didn't need to carry that burden. Even without it, the story was more than enough to leave them shaken. Vincent, ever dramatic, compared Arthur's experience to the adrenaline rush of dealing with tax paperwork. Tabitha was quieter, her disbelief evident as she spoke. The idea that Arthur had faced and defeated an Elderwood guardian, a monster she'd been threatened with as a child, was almost impossible to grasp. As the conversation shifted, Arthur turned to Reynolds and asked about his magic. Reynolds admitted with a sigh that he'd been stuck at the dark orange bottleneck ever since Arthur left. No amount of meditation or refinement seemed to push him forward. Arthur didn't hesitate. He reached into his storage and casually tossed the Elderwood Guardian's beast core toward his father, explaining that while he'd used a portion of it to recover, plenty of energy remained. Reynolds caught it on reflex, freezing as he stared at the dull green core resting in his palm. He held it like something sacred, unsure if he could even accept it, especially knowing the danger Arthur had faced to obtain it. Tabitha gasped as realization hit her. An S-class beast core was worth a fortune. Alice, arms crossed, responded with dry humor, questioning whether the gift made up for the endless worry Arthur had caused her. Arthur grinned and told his father to take it. If Reynolds wanted any hope of keeping up with his son, he'd need it. He even winked, openly challenging him not to fall behind. That was when Arthur revealed his current stage. Light orange. The room fell silent. Vincent's eyes nearly popped out of his head. Tabitha sucked in a sharp breath. Reynolds looked back down at the beast core, his grip tightening, determination flaring in his eyes. He promised Arthur he wouldn't hold back the next time they sparred. Arthur welcomed it with a confident grin. As the excitement finally settled, the family began drifting off to their rooms. The manor grew quieter. Elijah headed for a steam bath, predictably forgetting to lock the door. Just as he started to relax, the door burst open. Arthur strolled in like nothing was wrong, announcing that he'd brought Elijah's pajamas. Elijah yelped in panic, his voice echoing off the steamy walls as he scrambled to cover himself, shouting in pure embarrassment. Arthur squinted through the steam and waved it off, teasing that it wasn't a big deal. He couldn't see anything anyway. Elijah narrowed his eyes suspiciously and asked if that was really true. Arthur just laughed, tossed back a smug remark, and shut the door behind him. A barrage of curses and banging followed, making Arthur chuckle as he walked away. Later that night, Arthur sat quietly on his bed, pulling out the mask he hadn't worn in a long time. Arthur studied the mask in silence, letting the memories settle. 2 full years had passed, years packed with bloodshed, close calls, losses, and growth that had reshaped him in ways even he sometimes struggled to grasp. It felt distant now, like another life layered over this one. Nearby, Sylvie perched comfortably, her presence light and familiar. Through their bond, her voice chimed with her usual carefree confidence, proudly pointing out that she'd grown taller than him at some point. Arthur let out a short laugh, conceding the point. She wasn't wrong. Before the moment could stretch further, Elijah's voice cut in, reminding Arthur that it was his turn to wash up. Arthur agreed easily and headed for the bathroom. He didn't rush, easing the tension still lodged in his muscles from everything he'd been through. For once, there was no urgency, no threat lurking just beyond the door. Elijah immediately eyed him suspiciously, demanding to know why it had taken so long. Arthur answered casually, explaining that he'd spoken with Vincent about a few things, and had even brought up the idea of sponsoring Elijah for Xyrus Academy. That single sentence flipped a switch. Elijah's exhaustion vanished, excitement lighting up his face as he bombarded Arthur with questions, desperate to know what Vincent had said. Arthur only smiled, that familiar mischievous glint in his eyes, and refused to answer. Instead, he shut the door behind him, leaving Elijah stewing in suspense. Later that night, the two of them lay on the wide bed they shared, the room dim except for moonlight slipping through the curtains. Their conversation drifted naturally toward the future. Elijah couldn't hide his awe at the thought of attending Xyrus Academy, the prestige, the powerful students, the chance to train among the continent's elite. It all sounded unreal to him, like stepping into a legend. Arthur listened quietly. To him, the academy was less dazzling. He knew their current abilities already surpassed most first-year students, which meant the early curriculum might feel painfully slow. Still, he admitted it wouldn't be pointless. It would give him the time and structure he needed to refine his weaker attributes, lightning and ice magic. Even with his beast will backing him up, those elements still resisted him more than he liked. Eventually, Elijah's tone shifted. He brought up Lucas. He asked carefully what Arthur planned to do. Arthur let out a slow breath. Lucas didn't recognize him, and Arthur intended to keep it that way, until the day he was strong enough to stand against the entire Wykes family without consequence. His identity would remain buried. For now, revenge could wait. Training couldn't. Growth came first. Arthur found himself quietly appreciating how easily Elijah spoke his mind, even joking around topics most people would tiptoe around. His gaze drifted, landing on the ridiculous pillow wall Elijah had built between them. Arthur raised an eyebrow and asked if that was really necessary. Elijah insisted it was, arguing that it was already weird enough for two guys to share a bed. Arthur smirked and suggested that maybe Elijah would feel more comfortable if Arthur were a girl instead. The response was instant. A pillow flew straight at Arthur's head. Elijah flushed with embarrassment, while Arthur laughed, dodging easily and enjoying the rare, harmless moment. After a beat, Elijah peeked over the pillow barrier again, his voice quieter, more thoughtful. His mind had wandered somewhere else entirely. He wondered aloud if he might actually find a girlfriend at Xyrus Academy. Arthur, of course, couldn't resist. He painted an exaggerated future where Elijah married a black-haired girl with glasses just like him, their children somehow being born already wearing tiny spectacles. Elijah groaned and rolled his eyes, pointing out how ridiculous that was. Babies didn't come with glasses. Still, he laughed despite himself. Then he flipped the teasing back onto Arthur, claiming Arthur's looks alone would make him popular, whether he wanted it or not. Too princely, he said, for his own good. Arthur smirked and asked if that sounded like jealousy. Elijah shot back immediately that it wasn't subtle at all. It was blatant. Arthur waved it off. He wasn't interested in anyone at the academy. To him, girls his age still felt far too young, barely more than kids. There was no rush. What mattered was rest. He told Elijah to get some sleep. Elijah agreed quietly. There was gratitude in his voice, and with that, their banter faded. The room fell into silence, the world outside unusually calm as both of them drifted off. Morning arrived gently. Thin rays of sunlight slipped through the curtains, nudging Arthur awake. He rose, got ready, and headed downstairs. Vincent was already there, brimming with energy. He greeted Arthur enthusiastically, reminding him of the inventor Arthur had asked about the day before. Vincent wasted no time explaining that he'd already arranged a meeting. The man's name was Gideon. According to Vincent, Gideon wasn't just an inventor. He was a legendary artificer, one of the most respected researchers in all of Sapin. He was due to return to Xyrus City in 3 days, and Vincent suggested they meet him before heading downtown with everyone else. Arthur agreed immediately. When he asked what was happening downtown, Vincent mentioned a major announcement scheduled for the central square. Arthur acknowledged it, though his interest clearly lay elsewhere. He thanked Vincent for setting up the meeting. When Vincent asked if Arthur needed something specific from Gideon, Arthur explained that it wasn't a necessity. It was something he wanted to discuss, an idea from his past life that had waited patiently for the right moment. This meeting would be the first step toward bringing it into reality. Vincent was still trying to process that when Reynolds appeared. He called out to them, then immediately scolded Vincent for his messy appearance, reminding him he had somewhere important to be. Realizing he was already late, Vincent panicked, shouted that he'd pick Arthur up later, and bolted out the door. Reynolds watched him go, chuckling as he teased Vincent for running, while constantly looking back like a nervous child. Then he turned to Arthur. When Arthur asked about his magic, Reynolds' face lit up with pride. He announced that he'd finally broken through. Solid orange stage. The progress was real, and it showed. Reynolds reached into his pocket and pulled out the very same beast core Arthur had given him earlier. Even though every last drop of mana inside it had already been drained, the core hadn't shattered the way it normally should have. Instead, it sat there, perfectly intact, solid and heavy in his palm. The detail clearly bothered him. A drained beast core surviving like this wasn't normal. Far from it. But there was no time to overthink it now. He still had preparations to finish before heading out. With a satisfied, almost proud smile, Reynolds tucked the core away and told Arthur he'd be back by dinner. Then he stepped out, the door closing softly behind him. Arthur didn't move. He stood there in silence, mind spinning. Something about that core refused to sit right with him. After a moment, he turned and headed to the backyard. The beast core now in his own hand. Sunlight filtered through the open space as Arthur stopped and stared down at the orb again. It was still solid, still whole. Slowly, carefully, he wrapped his fingers around it and focused, extending his senses inward. This time, he felt it. Deep within the core's black, hollow interior, something stirred. The emptiness warped, shadows shifting until a shape began to form. Arthur's breath caught. The Elderwood Guardian. The image sharpened, unmistakable. Arthur froze in place as a chill crawled up his spine, quickly replaced by pure electric awe. His heart started pounding. That fight, one that had nearly killed him, had left behind a reward so absurdly rare it bordered on the unreal. A beast will, not just treasure, not just power, a phenomenon. A gift that granted its wielder immense strength and often a unique magical ability. Something that could only be obtained if a powerful mana beast willingly passed it on, or if it was torn out by force from its core. Arthur stared at the glowing orb in his hand, thoughts colliding violently in his head. And then, a dangerous idea took root. What if he tried to integrate not one beast will, but two? There were no records, no precedents, no ancient manuals warning him not to. Just a single, terrifying unknown. And Arthur had never been one to shy away from that. Without another second of hesitation, he tightened his grip and began pouring his mana into the core. Immediately, something answered back. This wasn't like the clear, emotional connection he shared with Sylvie. This was savage, primal, a raw, hostile presence roaring deep inside his consciousness. The will of the Elderwood Guardian lashed out violently, rejecting him with overwhelming force. Vines exploded forward in his mind, faster than sight, aiming straight for him, and shattered. They slammed into something invisible and broke apart instantly. Arthur's eyes widened as a powerful pressure surged around him. A barrier had formed, absolute and unyielding. He turned instinctively, and his breath stopped. Behind him stood Sylvia. Not her physical body, but her will. Towering, majestic, terrifying. The image of the great dragon loomed with overwhelming dominance, her massive form radiating authority. Her glowing eyes locked onto the Elderwood Guardian with cold finality. Space itself seemed to tremble as her will surged forward. Her jaws opened wide, rushing toward the wooden beast with unstoppable force. The Guardian convulsed, utterly crushed beneath the pressure. And then Arthur gasped awake. His eyes snapped open as the beast core slipped from his hand, clattering and rolling across the ground. His chest rose sharply as he sucked in air. He had stopped just in time. Arthur understood instantly. If he'd hesitated even a moment longer, Sylvia's beast will would have completely erased the Elderwood Guardian, destroying it beyond recovery. Any chance of passing that will on to someone else would have been gone forever. He bent down and picked up the core again, his thoughts drifting immediately to his father. Why couldn't Reynolds absorb it? The answer came easily. Elemental compatibility. Just like Grandpa Virion had explained long ago, a beast's attributes had to align with the mage's mana core. No matter how strong Reynolds was, his affinity simply didn't match the Elderwood Guardians. But Arthur already knew exactly who it would match. The days that followed passed swiftly. Arthur threw himself back into training, disciplined and relentless, refining his body and mana without letting his guard slip. But he didn't waste the peace either. He spent time with his family, laughing, relaxing, doing ordinary things that felt almost unreal after everything he'd been through. He knew better than anyone how fragile moments like these were. One morning, sunlight spilled gently through the windows as Arthur and Elijah lay sprawled across their bed, still deep in sleep. The quiet didn't last. The door creaked open. Ellie's small voice cut through the room, announcing that it was time for breakfast. Mom had called for them. Half asleep, Arthur mumbled something incoherent about wanting a luxurious dimensional ring, clearly still trapped in dreamland. Ellie reminded him that today was the announcement and that everyone needed to be ready. Then she grinned. Before Arthur could react, Ellie launched herself onto the bed and drove a sharp elbow straight into his chest. The impact knocked the air clean out of him. Arthur wheezed, clutching his sternum as pain flared. He shot Ellie a glare that was half annoyed, half impressed, reminding her she wasn't that small anymore, and that one day she might actually break something. Ellie gasped dramatically, eyes wide as she accused him of calling her fat. The accusation was completely fake, but the chaos was real. Arthur groaned, muttering about whatever insane things she must be learning at that school for proper ladies. Before leaving, Ellie reminded him to hurry up and come down. She, their mother, and Aunt Tabitha were heading out first. Once she disappeared, Arthur sighed, rubbing his ribs again, and wondering where she'd picked up such violent tendencies. From beside him, Elijah answered casually. He had a pretty good guess. Later that day, they boarded a carriage and set off. The scenery shifted as they traveled, towering buildings of the central district slowly giving way to smaller homes, workshops, and shops. Signboards hung everywhere, advertising artifacts, elixirs, and magical services. The air felt different here, less regal, more alive. Arthur leaned back, rubbing his stomach. He was still hungry. Elijah laughed, pointing out that Sylvie had stolen half his breakfast. Arthur couldn't argue. The little dragon was a menace when it came to food. Elijah decided to check out the nearby stores. Arthur questioned whether he even had money to buy anything. Elijah adjusted his glasses smugly, reminding Arthur that, unlike him, he'd actually been saving his dungeon earnings. Arthur smirked but let him go. He turned to Sylvie and nodded, signaling her to accompany Elijah while he handled something else. As Sylvie followed Elijah off, Arthur and Vincent headed toward a modest house, tucked between older buildings. The place wasn't impressive. Cracked steps, plain door, nothing special at a glance. But Arthur knew better. Behind that door waited someone he'd been very interested in meeting. Vincent stepped forward and knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet street. A moment later, the door creaked open just a sliver. Peering out was an elderly man dressed in a spotless butler's uniform, his posture immaculate. He began to speak in a rehearsed, almost weary tone, explaining that his master was unavailable and did not accept visitors. But midway through his sentence, his gaze shifted. Recognition flickered across his face as his eyes landed on Vincent. The change was instant. His expression straightened, his tone softened, and the door opened wider. With a polite bow, the butler Himes welcomed Vincent inside. Arthur followed close behind, earning a brief but curious glance. Vincent returned the greeting with an easy nod. It was clear they had met before, though not recently. The moment Arthur crossed the threshold, he nearly recoiled. A horrendous stench slammed into him like a physical force. It was sharp and metallic, thick with the smell of rust, burned chemicals, and something acrid he couldn't quite place. The air itself tasted like copper, clinging to his tongue and throat. Arthur's face twisted instinctively in disgust. Himes noticed and let out a small, amused chuckle. Then something moved. From within one of the heaps, an elderly man rose, brushing soot and metal shavings from his wild, unkempt hair. He looked irritated before he even spoke, and when he did, it was loud. He barked at the butler, demanding to know why someone had been let inside his workshop. But the moment his eyes landed on Vincent, his scowl softened, just slightly. Not enough to hide his annoyance, but enough to show familiarity. He complained that even though Vincent had called ahead, he wasn't in the mood for visitors. For over a year, he said, royal messengers had been pestering him nonstop, all demanding the same impossible thing: a way to cross the ocean. Arthur let out a small chuckle, genuinely intrigued. Why would anyone want to travel across the ocean in the first place? The answer came fast and sharp. Gideon snapped at him, telling him it was none of his business. Only then did Gideon pause. His sharp, analytical eyes narrowed as they settled on Arthur. There was caution in that stare now, the look of someone who sensed something unfamiliar. He asked Vincent who the boy was. Arthur stepped forward immediately, bowing with perfect courtesy. He introduced himself as Arthur Leywin, son of Reynolds Leywin, his tone respectful and composed. He even praised Gideon's reputation and contributions as an inventor and artificer. Gideon was unimpressed. He waved off the formality and turned back to Vincent, bluntly asking why Arthur had been brought here at all. Gideon made it clear. He did not take students. He did not accept disciples. He did not mentor. Vincent hesitated, then admitted honestly that he didn't know the full reason himself. Arthur had asked for the meeting. Arthur didn't deny it. He explained that he'd originally come to offer something else entirely. But when Gideon mentioned the issue of long-distance travel across the ocean, a new idea had formed in his mind. Instead of explaining, Arthur said it would be better to show. Before anyone could stop him, Arthur walked over to a cluttered workbench covered in parchment scraps and scattered tools. He pulled a clean sheet free, grabbed a charcoal pencil, and began to sketch. At first, Gideon barely glanced over, clearly dismissing it as the pointless doodling of a child. But then his eyes caught a detail, then another. Suddenly, he lunged forward and snatched the parchment out of Arthur's hands. His face hovered inches from the page, eyes wide, breath uneven. What Arthur had drawn wasn't magic circles or mana conduits. It was something else entirely. An engine, not powered by mana, but by steam, heat, pressure, external fuel. A concept so foreign to this world that it felt almost illegal. Gideon's hands trembled as he muttered under his breath, tracing the design with shaking fingers, mentally filling in gaps. But just as his excitement peaked, he stopped. Something was missing. Key components were absent, critical details deliberately omitted. Arthur calmly took the parchment back, stating that the complete design would be shared only after their negotiation concluded. Gideon exhaled slowly, long, heavy. He knew he was trapped. With a sharp snap of his fingers, he summoned his assistant. Himes appeared moments later, carrying a sealed case with extreme care. He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside rested an ironized diamond. The gem shimmered with contained power, its surface reflecting light like frozen lightning. Vincent gasped openly. This was a treasure capable of forging top-tier artifacts, something worth a fortune beyond measure. Arthur barely reacted. Gideon, undeterred, proudly explained that the jewel could store mana up to 5 times its own capacity. He waited for awe. It never came. Arthur wasn't impressed. Gideon's confidence cracked slightly. He snapped his fingers again, ordering Himes to bring everything from the middle shelf of row C. The butler complied, and soon the table was overflowing with enchanted weapons, rare tools, and glowing artifacts. Vincent looked like a child in a candy store, eyes darting everywhere. Gideon dug through the pile and produced a mirror, boasting that it could reflect spells up to 5 times their strength. Arthur smiled politely and declined. Again, now visibly shaken, Gideon rushed through item after item, explaining their powers, defensive capabilities, and market value. Many of them were superior to anything publicly available. Arthur examined a few, nodded once or twice, and refused them all. Finally defeated, Gideon rubbed his temples and gave one last order. He told Himes to bring the pendants. Himes hesitated, warning him that those were special. Gideon insisted. When Himes returned, he carried 2 small, ornate locked cases, far more refined than anything else in the room. These were artifacts crafted for royalty. Gideon unlocked one and opened it. Inside lay a delicate pendant. A soft pink gem rested at its center, suspended from a thin chain of white gold. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Arthur lifted it and infused a trace of mana. Within the jewel, an image shimmered into existence, a phoenix worm. Arthur recognized it instantly. Gideon stared at him in shock. Gideon confirmed it without hesitation. The pendant had indeed been crafted using the essence of a phoenix worm. Vincent, clearly intrigued but confused, asked what made those creatures so special in the first place. Gideon explained that phoenix worms were S-class mana beasts, almost as rare and elusive as dragons themselves. What set them apart was a single, terrifyingly powerful trait. When faced with death, they possessed the ability to preserve their own lives. Arthur immediately caught on. He asked whether that same life-preserving ability had been embedded into the pendant. Gideon's eyes lit up as he nodded enthusiastically. Just like a phoenix worm, the pendant would activate in moments of extreme danger, forming a hardened cocoon around the wearer to shield them from fatal harm. But that was only the first layer. If the cocoon were destroyed and the wearer's life was still in jeopardy, the pendant would then consume the mana stored within it and forcibly teleport the user to the safest location they were familiar with. It wasn't just a defensive artifact. It was condensed survival itself, packed into a single jewel. Inside the cluttered workshop, Arthur continued examining the pendant closely. After a moment, he asked the most important question. How many times could its effects actually be used? Gideon scratched the back of his head, looking uncomfortable, as he admitted he wasn't completely sure. He had already used 5 phoenix worm cores to create it, each one more valuable than almost any other S-class beast core in existence. And even then, he believed the pendant might only activate twice at most. Arthur fell silent, his thoughts turning inward. If the artifact truly functioned as described, it would be perfect for someone he needed to protect above all else. His mother, or Ellie. The idea lingered, until something else clicked in his mind. Earlier, Gideon had mentioned that these pendants were commissioned by the royal family. Arthur asked directly. Gideon confirmed it, stating that the phoenix worm cores had been provided by the royal family themselves. Still, he waved it off as unimportant. What truly mattered to him now was Arthur's earlier blueprint. His eyes narrowed with suspicion as he asked the real question. How could someone so young come up with an idea like that, and why bring it to him now? Arthur answered with a calm smile, claiming he simply wanted to make a nice birthday gift for his little sister. Gideon didn't buy it for a second. He didn't say it out loud, but he dismissed the excuse immediately. Arthur made his stance clear. He wasn't handing over the complete blueprint, unless he knew exactly how it would be used. Gideon tried to sidestep the condition, telling him that everything would be explained during the major announcement later that day. Arthur pushed back. Someone of Gideon's standing and knowledge, he reasoned, could surely explain things more clearly than a censored public speech ever would. Cornered, Gideon asked if revealing everything he knew would convince Arthur to leave the pendants behind. Arthur responded with nothing more than a smirk. He wasn't about to agree to a deal without getting real value in return. Growing desperate, Gideon tried bargaining again, suggesting he might part with just one pendant instead of both. Arthur didn't answer verbally. Instead, he raised his hand, a small but steady flame blooming in his palm, while holding the blueprint just close enough to make his point clear. He wasn't bluffing. Gideon growled under his breath, calling Arthur a demon as he finally realized the situation had completely flipped. The boy had total control. Vincent, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally stepped in. He admitted he didn't always understand what Arthur was thinking, but he vouched for one thing without hesitation. If Arthur made a promise, he would keep it. That was enough. Gideon let out a loud groan and finally gave in. He didn't care about the royal family anymore. Compared to this ship project, they were irrelevant. With a resigned sigh, he revealed the truth. Last year, his team had uncovered evidence, and now they were absolutely certain. There was another continent beyond Dicathen. Arthur froze. The idea hit him hard. Another continent. Something so massive, so world-altering, that it was difficult to even process. Vincent nodded slowly, adding that he had heard the same rumor from a royal family employee before. Someone who had been unsure, but warned him to keep it secret. Hearing it again from Gideon confirmed what Vincent had already begun to believe. Still, Arthur wasn't satisfied with rumors alone. He pressed Gideon, demanding proof, real evidence, not speculation. Gideon bristled, clearly insulted. He made it very clear that he wasn't the type of scientist who made baseless claims. His voice rose as he explained how it all began. Years ago, they had discovered a strange artifact attached to a bird-type mana beast. The creature wasn't native to Dicathen and possessed a unique ability, perfect camouflage, something no known beast on the continent could replicate. That alone was groundbreaking, but the artifact it carried changed everything. Vincent, still stunned, asked how they had even managed to capture such a creature. Gideon scowled as he admitted the truth. It was pure chance. An amateur adventurer aiming at a gliding squirrel had accidentally struck the bird instead. Dumb luck, nothing more. But that accident brought the artifact into their hands. The object was unlike anything Gideon had ever studied, so advanced that it took him nearly an entire year just to determine its function. And when he finally did, it confirmed every suspicion they had. Arthur leaned forward, demanding to know what it could do. Gideon hesitated, reminding him that only royal family members were authorized to know this information. Arthur didn't even blink. He simply pointed out that his own blueprints contained designs the royal families had never seen. Once again, Gideon was cornered. With visible irritation, he finally revealed the truth. The artifact could record and store moving images. Vincent leaned back with a quiet, satisfied smirk. Even someone as brilliant as Gideon couldn't outmaneuver Arthur. Arthur, however, wasn't impressed yet. He frowned slightly, voicing his doubt. Just because an artifact was advanced didn't automatically mean it came from another continent. Couldn't it have been created by an unknown but exceptionally talented artificer somewhere in Dicathan? Vincent responded calmly but firmly. He reminded Arthur that he hadn't introduced Gideon as just another skilled inventor. He was widely regarded as the greatest artificer Dicathan had ever produced. Not just in the present era, but in all of history. Still skeptical, Arthur shifted his gaze back to the eccentric old man, weighing those words carefully. There was doubt in Arthur's tone, but it wasn't baseless skepticism. It was calculated, grounded. Gideon, on the other hand, took it personally. His chest puffed out as pride swelled to ridiculous levels, and he loudly proclaimed his own brilliance. In his mind, there wasn't a single artificer in all of Dicathan who wouldn't drop to their knees in reverence before him. His confidence wasn't subtle. It was overwhelming, absolute, almost comical in its intensity. Arthur listened patiently, letting Gideon rant, and then a slow smile crept onto his face. If Gideon's words were true, and judging by his reputation they likely were, then even the greatest artificer in Dicathan, struggling for nearly a year to understand a single artifact, said everything. It suddenly made perfect sense why the royal families had jumped to such a drastic conclusion. Arthur voiced his reasoning calmly. If an artifact existed that even Gideon couldn't fully decipher, then the odds of it being created within Dicathan were slim. That alone was enough for the royals to believe its creator came from beyond the continent. Gideon leaned forward, veins practically popping, frustration boiling over. He was nearly shouting now, desperate to hammer the point into Arthur's head. This wasn't just some impressive device. This was proof of another world beyond the seas. A land filled with technologies more advanced, artificers more skilled, and possibly mages far beyond anything Dicathan had ever known. To Gideon, this discovery was earth-shattering, history-defining. But Arthur didn't budge. He calmly raised a hand, gently pushing Gideon back, grounding the conversation. Yes, the implications were massive. Yes, the possibilities were terrifying and exhilarating all at once. But speculation was still speculation. Until someone crossed the ocean, until they saw that land with their own eyes, everything Gideon was saying remained theory, no matter how convincing. Instead of getting swept up in excitement, Arthur quietly returned his attention to the parchment. He finished the sketch he had been working on. A steam engine. Simple in concept, revolutionary in execution. With it, they wouldn't need to guess. They would go there themselves. Only then would the truth be undeniable. Later, as Arthur and Vincent stepped outside the workshop, the air felt noticeably lighter. Vincent let out a chuckle, clearly amused by the absolute storm Gideon had turned into moments earlier. He admitted he had never seen the old artificer so animated, so fired up. That level of passion from someone like Gideon spoke volumes about what Arthur had just ignited. Arthur smiled faintly. Gideon really had been excited, more than anyone had ever seen him. Causing that kind of reaction from a legend wasn't something just anyone could do. Still, Vincent voiced his doubts. Gideon might have called Arthur's steam engine design ingenious, but Vincent himself couldn't picture it. A ship powered purely by steam, crossing an entire ocean without magic? It sounded absurd. In a world where mana solved everything, relying on something so mundane felt almost laughable. Arthur walked beside him, half listening, his thoughts drifting deep again. In this world, magic was the foundation of everything. Daily life, warfare, innovation, politics. Because mana was so convenient, so dominant, people had stopped looking for alternatives. Non-magical technology, once full of potential, had stagnated completely. Vincent kept talking, unaware of the gears spinning violently in Arthur's mind. He joked about Arthur's parents, wondering how Reynolds and Alice could be so calm about everything their son could do. If Vincent had a child like Arthur, he'd be shouting it from the rooftops. Arthur barely heard him. His focus was on what he had accomplished. With nothing more than harmless mechanical knowledge from another life, he had secured an artifact capable of protecting his family. And now, with the possibility of another continent looming beyond Dicathan's waters, Arthur knew this was only the beginning. That was when Sylvie's cheerful voice echoed in his head, snapping him out of his thoughts. She was approaching with Elijah, their presence drawing closer from the other side of the square. Elijah arrived first, brimming with energy as always, talking rapidly about the upcoming announcement. Apparently, Elder Rhaeus had hinted at talks of unifying the three kingdoms, and Elijah couldn't wait to hear more. Arthur wasn't as optimistic. If unification was truly on the table, he suspected it wasn't just politics. If Gideon was right about another continent, then this move might be defensive, preparing Dicathan for something far larger than internal disputes. Vincent smirked and teased that he already knew what the announcement would be, but before he could elaborate, chaos erupted nearby. The laughter hit first, sharp, cruel, wrong. The group turned toward the sound and saw it immediately. A dwarf boy was being beaten by several students. They circled him like vultures, laughing as he stumbled and fell. Bruised and trembling, the boy begged them to stop, insisting he hadn't done anything wrong. Their leader stepped forward, Jamiel. His voice dripped with arrogance and cruelty as he mocked the boy for being a dwarf, calling it a disgrace to Xyrus Academy. Then came the excuse. Accusations of breaking school rules, of using magic outside school grounds. Jamiel demanded the boy drop his mana barrier. The dwarf stammered, terrified, words barely forming. Jamiel didn't care. With a cold glare, he lifted a metal pipe, ready to bring it down. Before it could fall, Elijah moved. He dashed forward and slammed into Jamiel, knocking him off balance. Elijah immediately positioned himself between the bullies and the injured dwarf, helping him sit up and asking if he could stand. Jamiel rose slowly, rage burning in his eyes. Without warning, he slapped Elijah hard across the face. The sound cracked through the air. Elijah's glasses flew off and skidded across the ground. Jamiel sneered, demanding to know how Elijah dared interrupt his fun. Vincent reacted instantly, reaching into his coat, ready to summon the guards and shut this down before it escalated further. Arthur stopped him. His grip on Vincent's wrist was firm, unyielding. This wasn't going to end with guards. Not this time. Vincent whispered urgently, alarm clear in his voice. They couldn't let this continue. Meanwhile, Elijah was fighting a battle of his own. Rage burned in his chest, begging to be unleashed. He knew if he used magic now, it wouldn't just be his problem. Arthur and Vincent would be dragged into it as well. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe, forcing the mana to stay dormant. Jamiel's eyes dropped to the markings stitched into Elijah's robe. Recognition flashed. A twisted grin spread across his face as he realized it. The emblem of the Kingdom of Darv. The others noticed too, and their laughter turned sharper, nastier. Jamiel stepped forward, grabbing Elijah by the hair and yanking his head back, mocking him with cruel delight. He sneered about how Elijah might as well lie next to his half-pig brother on the ground. Elijah shook with restrained fury. He knew he couldn't win without mana, but he held it back. Jamiel leaned closer, ordering him to open his mouth, laughing about how they'd share a hospital room when he was done. And then something made him pause. A shadow slid across the sunlit ground, and Jamiel turned his head slightly. His eyes locked onto someone approaching at an unhurried pace, each step deliberate. It was Arthur, closing the distance with a long wooden stick resting in his hand. Jamiel scoffed at the sight. He sneered, mocking Arthur as just another peasant, warning him to back away unless he wanted to end up on the ground beside the other two. The students around him laughed and egged him on, but Arthur's expression never wavered. There was no fear, no hesitation, only a cold, sharp glint in his eyes. He stepped closer, silent, his presence alone welcoming the fight. Far from the brewing chaos, a royal carriage cloaked in plain colors rolled quietly through the city streets. Its wheels barely whispered against the road as it neared the center of Xyrus. Inside, Prince Curtis lounged back, irritation clear in his voice. He complained about the secrecy, saying he would rather have attended the event in Addistan with his parents than sneak through the city like a criminal. His royal guard responded calmly, explaining that security at the event was already strict and that Curtis's movements had to remain discreet. In truth, the caution had little to do with the prince himself. Princess Kathleen had made it abundantly clear that she wanted no attention. Kathleen sat across from her brother, her displeasure obvious. She reminded him that she never wanted to come at all. Curtis grinned and teased her, claiming she should be thankful he dragged her out. Otherwise, she would have buried herself in books all day. Kathleen shot him a sharp glare. She knew the real reason. She pointed out that the only reason he insisted she come was because his date had canceled at the last moment. Curtis tried to brush it off, but his ears reddened, and he hastily changed the subject to his bond, Grotter, whom he had reluctantly left behind. He had wanted to ride the massive creature during the public event, but thanks to Kathleen, that plan had been abandoned. The guard reminded him that Grotter, being as large as the entire carriage and still untrained, was an enormous safety hazard. Curtis waved it off and tried to get Kathleen to agree, asking if Grotter hadn't been improving lately. Kathleen didn't respond. Her attention had shifted to the view outside the window. She had noticed a crowd forming, tension thick in the air. Something was happening in the street, and she couldn't look away. Back at the confrontation, Vincent stood stiffly, unsure of what to do. His heart hammered in his chest. He had never seen Arthur like this before. The familiar calm was gone, replaced by something cold and razor-sharp. If no one intervened now, Vincent feared those students wouldn't just be hurt. They might not leave at all. He hurried forward, positioning himself in front of Arthur, raising his voice as he shouted at the arrogant students. He ordered them to leave before someone was seriously injured. Turning back, he pleaded with Arthur to let it go and check on Elijah instead. The students only laughed. They mocked Vincent, calling him a foolish old man trying to shield a child. Their smug faces showed no hint of understanding. Inside, Vincent was screaming. They didn't realize the truth. He wasn't protecting Arthur. He was trying to protect them. Arthur spoke calmly, calling out to his uncle. Vincent turned, forcing a strained smile as he replied. his voice trembling. Then he saw it. Mana radiated from Arthur, sharp and focused. Arthur didn't need to raise his voice. The order was unmistakable. Vincent stepped aside. He understood now. Nothing was going to stop what came next. He cast one last glance at the boys and silently wished them peace. One of the students stepped forward confidently, volunteering with a joke about not damaging his new clothes. Grinning, he charged at Arthur, pipe raised high. It would be easy. One swing and it would be over. But before the strike could even begin, Arthur's stick slammed into his head. The boy crumpled instantly, collapsing with a groan. Shock rippled through the group. They hadn't even seen Arthur move. Another student snarled in anger, claiming Arthur had only gotten lucky by catching someone off guard. He boasted that he would show the difference between a noble trained in swordsmanship and a common peasant. He rushed forward, faster than the eye could follow, his metal pipe cutting through the air in a lethal arc. His movements were refined and precise, executing his family's prized thousand-step strike. The weapon swayed erratically, meant to confuse and overwhelm. In his mind, victory was already secured. The final lunge was flawless, unstoppable. To Arthur, everything slowed. He saw every motion, every shift of weight. At the final instant, he tilted his head just enough for the pipe to whistle past him harmlessly. The noble's confidence shattered. Arthur moved. A single clean strike landed on the boy's back. The stick snapped on impact. The noble collapsed, breath torn from his lungs, pain carved across his face. Arthur glanced at the broken stick in his hand, remarking how easily even mana-reinforced objects broke when pushed too far. He let the remains fall from his fingers. There were still others standing. He rolled his shoulders, composed and steady. Arthur no longer needed a weapon. This would end with his bare hands. Jamiel stared at Arthur, arrogance still etched across his face. To him, Arthur was nothing more than an overconfident peasant in need of discipline. His father's words echoed in his mind. A trident's fist was deadlier than any forged weapon. The thought fueled his pride. One punch would be enough. But as Jamiel stepped closer, something changed. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the pressure alone could crush him. Jamiel froze, startled by the overwhelming presence radiating from someone his own age. He had never felt anything like it, not even from his father. Still, pride drove him forward. He lunged, fist clenched tight. Arthur's fist met his face first. The blow landed with brutal precision, twisting Jamiel's features as blood spilled from his nose. His body spun before crashing to the ground. His vision swam, but through the haze he could still see Arthur standing there, unmoved. Rage consumed him. Jamiel shouted, seething with humiliation, screaming that Arthur had dared to disrespect the heir of House Trident. In a desperate move, Jamiel summoned his mana. Water coalesced around his hand, sparkling with lethal intent, and with a roar of rage, he sent a torrent of magic hurtling toward Arthur. But before the attack could strike, a solid wall of ice erupted in front of him, shattering his spells harmlessly. Standing calm and composed before the carriage was Princess Catherine, who had arrived just in time. Her eyes locked on Arthur, memories flickering back to their first meeting at the Helsty auction house. Back then, she had dismissed him as another ordinary boy, just like her immature brother or his friends. But now, there was something magnetic about him, something different. Arthur wasn't like the others. From the carriage, Prince Curtis emerged, voice booming across the street. Explain this. His presence alone froze Jamiel and his gang in place. The royal siblings' appearance struck fear into their hearts, forcing them to drop to their knees, faces pressed to the ground. Their trembling voices stammered excuses. They claimed they had just been talking when Arthur attacked. Elijah's jaw dropped. He opened his mouth to defend the truth, but Jamiel interrupted, feigning innocence. Kathleen, however, was sharper. Her gaze swept to the battered dwarf on the ground, and her instincts screamed that the story didn't add up. If Arthur had attacked unprovoked, how had the dwarf ended up so badly hurt? Curtis looked to her, confused, but she said nothing, analyzing the scene herself, silently wishing her brother would stop believing lies so easily. Arthur finally broke the silence. His voice, icy and blunt, cut through the tension like a blade. What a joke. Jamiel, still kneeling, smirked internally. To him, it sounded like an insult aimed at the prince himself. The royal guard reacted instantly, seizing Arthur's shoulder and demanding an explanation for his supposed disrespect. Arthur didn't flinch. Instead, he twisted the guard's wrist with shocking strength, keeping his voice calm, almost sarcastic, as he apologized, claiming his tone became sharp when lies filled the air. The guard froze, dumbfounded. Despite Arthur's youthful frame, the raw power in his grip was undeniable. Vincent stepped in swiftly, placing himself between Arthur and the guard. He addressed Curtis directly, clarifying that Arthur meant no disrespect. What Arthur was really saying, Vincent explained, was that the boys accusing him were the ones lying. Curtis's eyes widened in surprise as he recognized Vincent. He greeted him politely and asked why he was here. Vincent explained that on their way to the plaza for the announcement, they had stumbled upon a group of students tormenting a boy. On cue, the injured dwarf coughed up blood, a sharp, ugly reminder of what had just occurred. Curtis's gaze sharpened like a blade as he demanded a name. The leader stepped forward, exuding arrogant confidence. Jamiel L., firstborn of House Trident, he announced. Curtis's eyes narrowed. House Trident wasn't just any noble family. They were major benefactors of both the royal family and Xyrus Academy. The political weight of Jamiel's actions couldn't be ignored. Curtis hesitated, caught between justice and diplomacy. Any harsh punishment could spiral into far-reaching consequences. Kathleen tried to interject, warning that Jamiel's use of magic in public was a serious violation. But Curtis silenced her mid-word, suggesting that since no one was fatally harmed, perhaps it was better to let it slide. Jamiel inwardly celebrated. In his mind, victory was his. His family's influence could shield him, even from the royal family. But Arthur wasn't finished. He turned to Vincent and asked about a two-way communication scroll. Vincent hesitated, unsure, then confirmed he had one. Arthur snatched it without hesitation and activated it instantly. He wasn't calling just anyone. His voice connected directly to Cynthia Goodsky, director of Xyrus Academy. Jamiel's face drained of color. The audacity alone was stunning, and it was happening in front of a crowd. Cynthia's initial irritation melted into recognition and warmth as she heard Arthur speak. Everyone nearby felt the shift. Arthur wasted no time. Calm and controlled, he demanded that Jamiel Trident and his friends be expelled from the academy, citing racial bullying and the reckless use of lethal magic in public. Confusion flickered across Cynthia's face, especially at the mention of Jamiel's full name. Meanwhile, Jamiel stood, grinning smugly, convinced that his family's wealth and donations would outweigh Arthur's influence. Arthur's calm confidence didn't waver. He made it clear. His demands were conditional. The balance of power had shifted completely, and everyone watching understood. This was just the beginning. Arthur made it clear without finishing the sentence. He would only continue attending Xyrus Academy if decisive action was taken. There was no need to elaborate further. Cynthia's voice cut through with unwavering authority, sharp and final. "They're expelled." The words landed like a hammer, shattering Jamiel's world in an instant. And just as if fate wanted to pile on the humiliation, his mother called him through her own communication scroll. Her voice was a storm of fury, laced with disbelief and outrage. How could the Academy dare expel her son without explanation? Every syllable dripped with anger, leaving Jamiel frozen in dread. Meanwhile, Prince Curtis stepped forward, his posture shifting from annoyance to measured acknowledgement. With a formal, respectful tone, he apologized to Arthur, admitting that his earlier hesitation had been influenced by political pressure and doubt. Arthur, in turn, nodded and admitted that his own temper had flared during the confrontation. A tense understanding passed between them, a mutual recognition of each other's principles. Curtis affirmed that expelling Jamiel L. and his gang was not just the right call, it was essential. No noble lineage, no lavish donation could justify allowing racism to fester within their academy. Not in Xyrus, not on their continent. Curtis stepped back toward the royal carriage, rubbing at his temples. A clear headache etched across his features. His mind kept drifting to Arthur. There was something off, something strange and quietly formidable about the boy. He had felt it before at their first encounter, and the sensation had not faded. Arthur wasn't just good, he was different, in a way Curtis could not yet define. Kathleen's gaze, however, was unwavering. She hadn't taken her eyes off Arthur since the fight began. The world around her had blurred to insignificance. Then, just as the carriage was ready to roll, she spoke. Arthur turned toward the sound, startled. She met his eyes through the window, and in a rare softness, one no one else had ever witnessed, she asked, "Would you like to have tea with me sometime?" Arthur froze for a heartbeat before answering with a quick, honest, "Yes." Kathleen's lips curved into a gentle smile. "Then we'll see each other at school." The carriage moved forward, gliding down the street, while Arthur stood smiling quietly. Vincent and Elijah beside him were frozen in disbelief, jaws slack, unable to process the scene. Inside the carriage, Curtis stared blankly, gripping his royal guard's shoulders and shaking him in disbelief. His mind could not comprehend what had just transpired. That cold, disciplined sister of his had spoken with warmth. But Kathleen's thoughts were elsewhere. Quietly, she kept her attention fixed on one thing: Arthur. In her heart, she admitted it. He truly was different. Back on the street, Arthur walked side by side with Vincent and Elijah. Elijah's frustration was still palpable. If he had been able to use magic, he said with a huff, those bullies would have been flattened in seconds. Vincent, by contrast, was utterly drained. He clutched his chest and muttered under his breath, defeated, "I don't think my blood pressure can survive much more of this." Later that day, the city square outside the palace swelled with life. Citizens from across the continent, humans, elves, and dwarves alike, gathered shoulder to shoulder, anticipation radiating from every face. Everyone had come to hear the long-awaited announcement. Eli, walking beside Arthur, gestured to Elijah's bruised cheek. "What happened here?" he asked. Elijah grinned and recounted the story with pride, detailing how he had stood up to the bullies. But Arthur's mind wandered. His gaze swept over the crowd, thousands of faces staring expectantly. and his thoughts sank deeper. The truth he knew was monumental. Another continent existed beyond Dicathen's waters. And yet, what troubled him most wasn't just the discovery, it was the reason behind it. A land sending camouflaged monobeasts to observe Dicathen likely didn't have peaceful intentions. They were either wary of Dicathen or preparing for something far darker. Arthur's conscience wrestled with itself. Had he been right to push Dicathen's progress forward so rapidly? He had given his people a path to this unknown continent. But was it truly the best course of action? Before these thoughts could drag him further into doubt, his mother, Alice, noticed his expression. Her tone was gentle, soft enough to coax him from his spiraling thoughts. "Something on your mind?" she asked. Arthur waved it off with a small smile, insisting all was fine. Alice's eyes twinkled knowingly. She pretended to believe he was thinking the ordinary thoughts of a 12-year-old. Yet the undertone of her words carried reassurance. She would always worry, but never stop him from pursuing what he knew was right. Arthur returned her smile faintly, touched, but he knew he could never promise her peace of mind. His path was too dangerous, the risks too real. Still, he thanked her, and tried to appear more at ease than he felt. A hush fell over the plaza as King Blaine Glader stepped onto the stage. His voice, powerful and commanding, carried across the square. He didn't speak merely as the King of Sapan, but as a representative of the entire continent. Standing alongside the rulers of the three kingdoms, he proclaimed that today marked the dawn of a new era. He spoke of past divisions, humans and elves, dwarves, and their transactional relationship with others. But then his tone shifted. He spoke of progress. 2 years prior, all three races had been permitted to join the adventurer guilds. The previous year, Xyrus Academy opened its gates to students from Elenoir and Darv. These steps, he declared, were the foundation, the first bricks of continental unity. A new generation of mages was rising, learning, training, and forming bonds that crossed borders. King Blaine acknowledged the challenges ahead. Centuries of prejudice wouldn't vanish overnight, but urged the people to look forward, not just for themselves, but for their children and the future of Dicathen. His words ignited the crowd, met with thunderous cheers and a celebration of hope. Next, King Alduin Erleth of Elenoir stepped forward. With calm dignity, he echoed Blaine's message, pledging his full support for this vision of unity. Then his tone shifted. With measured gravity, he reminded the crowd that while Dicathen had begun uncovering its own mysteries, even greater secrets lay beyond their shores. He confirmed what many had only whispered in speculation. Another continent existed. The plaza fell silent. Whispers rippled through the crowd, disbelief spreading like wildfire. Some gasped, others murmured anxiously. The celebratory energy twisted instantly into shock and uncertainty. Arthur remained unmoved amidst the chaos. He had expected hesitation, perhaps fear, but this overwhelming reaction revealed just how unprepared the world was for the truth. Alduin raised his hands, trying to steady the murmuring crowd. He admitted that even the royal families knew very little about this distant land. The way there remained unknown, a continent shrouded in mystery, adventure, and possible danger. What was clear, however, was that attempts had already been made to reach Dicathen from the other side. Evidence suggested observation and reconnaissance, though neither civilization yet possessed the technology to traverse the waters fully. Confused murmurs and uneasy whispers grew louder as uncertainty spread. Then the Dwarf King strode onto the stage. His deep, commanding voice cut through the noise, immediately drawing attention and silencing the crowd. All eyes turned to him. Like Alduin, he admitted their knowledge was limited, but he emphasized a simple truth. In moments like these, unity was essential. The three races could no longer afford to see each other as rivals. Culture, appearance, and history might differ, but at heart, they were all children of Dicathen. He expressed his pride in that shared legacy and urged future generations to feel the same. For a long moment, silence lingered. Then tentative claps began, spreading and swelling into a roar of approval. The cheers echoed across the city square. For the first time in generations, humans, elves, and dwarves stood together as one. The Dwarf King continued. True unity, he said, would require time, effort, and patience. But to begin this new era, 6 individuals had been chosen. Selected by the royal families for courage, wisdom, strength, and responsibility, they would serve as protectors of Dicathen, standing directly alongside the kings and queens. From that day forward, they would be known as the 6 Lances. These weren't just defenders. They were symbols, each representing not only their own kingdom, but the unity of the entire continent. From the back of the stage, 6 figures emerged. 2 elves, 2 humans, 2 dwarves. Each wore white armor, elegant and tailored to their race and stature. They knelt gracefully before the rulers and the crowd. The kings approached with ornate boxes, drawing 2 rings each, initiating the ceremonial appointment. Alea Triskin, Varai Orai, Ulfred Warrant, Aya Greffin, Micah Earthborn, and finally, Bacon Wykes. Elijah, standing near Arthur, froze. He caught it, the name Wykes. His eyes widened in disbelief. The plaza erupted. Cheers, whistles, and chants filled the air as the 6 lances rose and bowed. King Blaine stepped forward once more, speaking directly to them, charging them to protect Dicathen and uphold its honor. He addressed aspiring mages across across the continent, encouraging them to dream boldly, that even the heavens were no longer a limit. As his words faded, the magical orbs projecting the announcement gently fell to the ground, signaling the ceremony's end. But for Arthur, the day carried a weight beyond awe and excitement. His gaze lingered on the name Wykes, Lucas Wykes, the very person responsible for betraying his old party. The one whose actions had led to the deaths of most of Arthur's comrades, had escaped justice. Lucas had used his family's influence to avoid consequences, and now the truth hit harder. Bacon Wykes, Lucas's older brother, was not only a powerful mage, but had been chosen as one of the 6 lances. Arthur's mind narrowed. The path ahead had just grown far more dangerous. Arthur stood before the mirror longer than he normally would, adjusting clothes he would never have chosen on any ordinary day. The fabric shimmered faintly under the light, tailored with a level of flair that made him uncomfortable. It was excessive, almost theatrical. But tonight wasn't about his preferences. It was Ellie's birthday. With a quiet sigh, he straightened his collar one last time and turned toward the door. Sylvie had been circling him nonstop, wings twitching, tail flicking with barely contained excitement. The moment Arthur reached for the handle, she bounced forward, clearly ready to follow. He stopped her gently with a raised hand. Tonight she would stay behind. The change was instant. Her lively energy drained away, replaced by wide, disappointed eyes. Arthur paused, guilt tugging at him. He knelt beside her and brushed his hand over her head, his touch slow and reassuring. He explained softly that Vincent had warned him. Some of the guests attending the party weren't coming just to celebrate. They would smile, laugh, and congratulate Ellie, all while quietly watching him, measuring him. Arthur wasn't willing to gamble her safety, not even for a night. Still, he sweetened the blow with a promise. He'd bring back food, a lot of it. That did the trick. Sylvie's gloom vanished in an instant, replaced with renewed enthusiasm as her tail wagged furiously. Arthur smiled despite himself and lifted his hand, giving her a small high five to seal the deal before finally heading out. Hellsday Manor had been transformed. The ballroom glowed with warm golden light, every corner dressed in elegant decorations and colorful magical ornaments that shimmered softly. Laughter and chatter filled the air. Arthur's duty for the evening, assigned by his mother without room for protest, was to greet Ellie's classmates as they arrived. It wasn't exactly thrilling, but he played his part, offering polite smiles and calm welcomes. As his gaze swept the room, he spotted Elijah nearby, deep in conversation with a girl from the academy. Elijah was laying it on thick, boasting confidently about his imminent enrollment at Xyrus Academy, his charm dialed up to an almost absurd degree. With a dramatic wink, he even asked her out. Then fate intervened. His elbow clipped a wine glass. The crystal tipped, fell, and emptied itself down the front of his shirt. Elijah froze, staring down at the spreading stain in stunned silence. Arthur turned away, lips twitching in amusement, but not fast enough. Elijah caught him watching. Their eyes met, and Elijah shot him a look that practically screamed, "Don't you dare acknowledge this." Before Arthur could enjoy the moment further, Reynolds's voice rang out, loud and commanding, announcing the arrival of the evening's special guests. The doors opened shortly after, and Eleanor's confused voice echoed through the hall as she questioned why they weren't heading out to dinner like she'd been told. She didn't finish the sentence. The lights flared to life all at once. The chandelier ignited in brilliant radiance, magical decorations bursting into color. The room exploded with sound. As everyone shouted, "Surprise!" Eleanor stood motionless. Confusion flickered across her face, followed by dawning realization, and then pure joy. Her eyes lit up as the truth sank in. Before she could even react properly, her friends swarmed her, laughter and hugs crashing over her in a storm of birthday wishes. When the excitement settled just enough, Reynolds raised his glass again, smiling proudly as he announced that it would please him greatly to see his son and daughter open the evening with the first dance. Eleanor's smile vanished. Color drained from her face as panic set in. Dancing in front of everyone had clearly not been part of her expectations. Tabitha leaned over, whispering curiously, asking if Arthur and Eleanor had practiced. Alice's expression tightened immediately, irritation written clearly as she silently blamed Reynolds for springing this on them. Eleanor turned to her mother, voice low and desperate. She admitted she didn't know how to dance and asked what they were supposed to do. That was when Arthur stepped forward. Calm and unhurried, he removed his gloves and approached his sister. He bowed slightly and extended a hand, offering reassurance without a single word. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before nodding and placing her hand in his. Trust outweighed fear. Applause followed as Arthur guided her onto the dance floor. At Reynolds' signal, musicians emerged from behind the stage, instruments already in hand. The music began. Arthur's movements were smooth and assured. One hand held Eleanor's, the other rested lightly at her waist. He led her gently, guiding her through each step with practiced ease. Her coral-colored dress flowed gracefully as they turned, following his lead like a tide. Tabitha watched closely, surprise evident as she once again remarked that she was certain they hadn't practiced. Alice confirmed it, still incredulous. Arthur remained composed throughout. This wasn't new to him. Long ago, another life. He had attended formal gatherings where such dances were routine. The memory of those skills surfaced effortlessly. Eleanor relaxed as the song continued. The tension melted away, replaced by laughter and genuine enjoyment. By the final notes, she moved confidently, perfectly in sync with Arthur. They finished together, stopping precisely as the music faded. The room erupted in applause. Compliments came from all sides. Eleanor glowed, pride and happiness lighting her face. Just as the cheers began to die down, Gideon approached Arthur, clapping exaggeratedly. His praise dripped with sarcastic flair, theatrical disgust coloring every word. Without waiting for a reply, Gideon asked to speak privately. Arthur wasted no time slipping away, heading out into the backyard where the cool night air washed over him like relief. Gideon followed, unsurprisingly unwilling to let the moment pass. Ever blunt, Gideon joked about Arthur performing like the star of a solo play. Arthur shot back that he hoped Gideon hadn't shown up to his sister's birthday just to corner him. Gideon claimed offense, insisting he'd brought a gift for Eleanor as well. Arthur remained skeptical but relented, asking what had drawn the continent's most renowned artificer to him. Gideon smirked at the title, pretending to be insulted before revealing the real reason. The council, the former monarchs of Dicathen now ruling together, had officially approved the refined designs based on Arthur's original blueprint. Construction had already begun. Arthur offered a brief congratulation, well aware that Gideon had likely earned a fortune from the council's decision. Gideon waved away the idea of chasing wealth, fame, or authority as if they were trivial distractions. To him, those things were never the destination, only instruments to reach something greater. Whatever his true ambition was, it stretched far beyond what even the ruling council could grant him. Before he could expand on that thought, his presence drew attention. A group of excited children rushed over, eyes wide with awe, bombarding him with praise. They spoke animatedly about his creations, especially the massive ship he had designed, clearly the stuff of legends to them. Gideon tried to dismiss them politely, insisting he was occupied. But admiration has a way of ignoring schedules. As he was pulled away, he turned back just long enough to warn Arthur not to disappear again. Arthur did exactly that. Slipping away once more, he wandered through the yard, his thoughts drifting as easily as his steps. Fame, he reminded himself, wasn't merely a stepping stone. It carried weight, expectations, consequences that couldn't be shrugged off. Eventually, he settled into a quiet corner of the backyard, a glass of apple cider in hand. The sounds of the party dulled into a distant hum. From across the lawn, he noticed Lilia approaching, having just arrived alongside David. She waved in his direction before turning toward Tim, then paused to greet Arthur properly. She apologized for arriving late, explaining that she'd wanted to congratulate Eleanor first. Arthur returned her smile, remarking that her parents had already mentioned how busy she'd been lately, especially with her responsibilities as the student council's secretary. He added casually that it had been quite some time since they'd last spoken. Lilia hesitated, nodding in agreement. Up close, she couldn't help but notice how much Arthur had changed. He seemed taller somehow, more composed. It caught her off guard, like seeing someone familiar through a different lens. Their conversation warmed naturally. They traded stories, shared old memories, and laughed quietly together. Arthur teased her gently, recalling how the timid girl who once sneaked away from her parents just to eat with the manor staff had grown into a confident young woman. Lilia flushed at the memory, protesting that she had once trusted him enough to show him her most secret hiding place, and now he still teased her for it. Arthur smiled. He genuinely admired how far she'd come. All those years of uncertainty and worry had led her to success at one of the most prestigious mage academies in all of Dicathen. As they spoke, Arthur noticed several boys passing by, each casting subtle, lingering glances in Lilia's direction. It was obvious she'd become quite popular. Lilia blinked in surprise, immediately denying it. She insisted she didn't even have a boyfriend, and claimed that everything she'd achieved was thanks to Arthur. He responded lightly, saying that if she truly believed that, then he supposed he'd have to approve any future suitor himself. After all, he wouldn't be any less strict than her father, Vincent. The comment landed heavier than intended. For just a heartbeat, something flickered in Lilia's expression. Disappointment, perhaps, or something unspoken. But she quickly masked it with a laugh, brushing it aside as if it meant nothing. Before the moment could linger, Gideon returned. His approach was unusually polite, a half-smile fixed on his face as he interrupted and asked Arthur for a word. Though surprised, Lilia handled it gracefully. She smiled, waved goodbye to Arthur, bowed politely to Gideon, and disappeared back into the crowd. Watching her go, Gideon couldn't resist boasting about the attention he'd been drawing. Arthur offered only a brief, indifferent response. Unbothered, Gideon shifted the focus, remarking on Lilia's behavior and suggesting she seemed to harbor feelings for Arthur. Arthur didn't deny it. He took a calm sip of his drink. When Gideon asked whether Arthur intended to act on it, Arthur answered evenly. What Lilia felt wasn't love. It stemmed from change. Dramatic change that Arthur himself had caused. Gratitude, admiration, perhaps even an illusion born from having her fate altered. In time, she would understand the difference. What she felt now was the kind of infatuation a young girl might have toward a hero, not affection forged through true understanding. Gideon scoffed, mocking Arthur's mature handling of the situation, admitting it almost made him ill. Arthur ignored the sarcasm. He knew Gideon hadn't chased him down just to discuss emotions. And finally, Gideon revealed the truth. He intended to use the wealth, influence, and authority the council had granted him to obtain something far more valuable. Arthur's knowledge. Not prestige, not power, understanding, the kind that could reshape civilizations. Arthur didn't react with enthusiasm. He reminded Gideon that even sharing the steam engine's design had left him conflicted. Dicathen had its own rhythm, its own course. It wasn't his place to forcibly redirect it. But Gideon heard what Arthur didn't say. There were more ideas, more knowledge, locked away. The realization lit a dangerous spark in Gideon's eyes. Arthur noticed immediately. Gideon was hearing only what he wanted. Tired of the pressure, Arthur infused mana into his voice and issued a quiet warning, low, controlled, meant for Gideon alone. The effect was instant. Gideon flinched. Recovering quickly, he retreated from his demands and offered a compromise instead. He proposed a partnership. Gideon would become Arthur's personal supplier, providing any artifacts or resources he needed in exchange for occasional guidance and insight. Arthur considered it briefly. Then he extended his hand, a calm, sharp smile on his face. They shook. The deal was sealed. The night carried on in a haze of laughter, music, dancing, and clinking glasses until the celebration finally began to wind down. Arthur stood quietly to the side, watching as his family gathered around Eleanor one last time. Reynolds and Alice stepped forward together, presenting their daughter with a carefully prepared gift, elegant hair ties adorned with tiny ornamental bells that chimed softly when moved. It was a simple, yet heartfelt present, one filled with warmth and affection. But Arthur's attention drifted elsewhere. Another gift sat nearby, subtly distinct from the others. Its wrapping was refined, deliberate, almost restrained. Eleanor noticed it too. Her curiosity ignited, she hurried over and eagerly began unwrapping it. Alice asked who the gift was from, but Arthur could only shake his head. He didn't know. Inside the box lay a letter addressed directly to Eleanor. Arthur picked it up and read it aloud. The words weren't from family or friends. The writer spoke with quiet understanding, acknowledging Eleanor's admiration for her brother, but urging her not to remain in his shadow. The message encouraged her to grow stronger, to walk beside Arthur as an equal rather than watching him from behind. Eleanor's breath caught. She reached into the box and slowly lifted out the gift. A bow. Not an ordinary one, but a masterfully crafted weapon, elegant and refined. Its form alone drew the attention of the entire room. Tabitha was the first to voice her admiration, praising its beauty. Vincent leaned in closer, recognizing the intricate craftsmanship and delicate patterns woven into its design, features unmistakably reminiscent of elven work. Even Reynolds frowned slightly, puzzled by the rarity and meaning behind such a gift. Arthur remained silent. Something about the bow, the intent behind it, the message it carried, stirred a faint sense of familiarity deep within him, a feeling he couldn't quite grasp. Before he could dwell on it further, Eleanor turned toward him, eyes shining, as she reminded him that she was still waiting for his present. Alice gently scolded her for her impatience, but Eleanor only laughed, clearly unable to contain her excitement. Arthur smiled. He handed Eleanor a small box, while discreetly passing a second one to their mother. Eleanor tore into the wrapping without hesitation. The moment she saw what lay inside, her expression lit up completely. Nestled within was a delicate pendant, an enchanted necklace, crafted from rare materials, shimmering faintly with mana. Arthur explained calmly that both pendants were protective artifacts, designed to safeguard them in moments when he or Reynolds couldn't be there. Tabitha admired the craftsmanship aloud, wondering where such rare pieces had been acquired. Vincent answered proudly. They were one of a kind. Arthur stepped closer and fastened the necklace around Eleanor's neck himself. She looked up at him, smiling brightly, as he quietly wished her a happy birthday. The moment was simple and perfect. In the days that followed, life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Even Arthur's own birthday passed quietly, just as he had requested. There were no grand celebrations. The twin horns were still deep within the continent, on an extended expedition, though a letter arrived confirming their safety. Unlike Eleanor's lively party, Arthur's birthday was spent with family alone, and that was more than enough. Over the following months, Arthur found himself growing closer to Gideon. Beneath the artificer's eccentric habits and relentless curiosity was someone dependable, loyal in his own way. Their long discussions and shared work slowly formed a bond neither of them openly acknowledged, yet both had come to value. One day, Gideon led Arthur into his personal workshop, a highly restricted facility accessible only to council members and a select few trusted individuals. Gideon took every opportunity to remind Arthur of how rare this privilege was, clearly enjoying the moment. Arthur responded with mild sarcasm. He'd already heard the reminder several times. Gideon accused him of being ungrateful, pointing out Arthur's lack of visible excitement. Arthur countered that it was difficult to feel impressed when Gideon hovered over every detail like an anxious parent. The two bickered back and forth, their exchange sounding less like colleagues and more like family. Gideon joked about their late-night discussions accomplishing nothing, Arthur shot back, telling him to go make friends his own age. Then Gideon's tone shifted. He brought up Arthur's birthday, surprised by how much time had passed. It had already been over 4 months since Eleanor's celebration. Curious, he asked whether Arthur's own birthday had been just as extravagant. Arthur shook his head. He'd asked for something small, private, just family. Gideon found that unexpected, especially after seeing how naturally Arthur had moved through Eleanor's party. Still, after a brief pause, he offered a rare, sincere wish for a belated happy birthday. Then he handed Arthur a box. Arthur glanced at it, amused, asking what it was. Gideon told him to open it. Arthur raised an eyebrow, teasing him for not even bothering to wrap it. Gideon huffed, pretending to be offended and threatening to take it back. Arthur laughed and opened it. Inside was a sleek, finely crafted bracelet, an artifact made specifically for him. Arthur thanked him genuinely. Gideon waved it off, saying it was nothing compared to Arthur's contributions to the steam engine. But then his curiosity surfaced. He asked why Arthur needed a bracelet capable of concealing not one, but 2 elemental affinities. Half-joking, Gideon asked if Arthur was secretly a quadra-elemental mage. Arthur answered casually. He was. Gideon froze. The realization hit him instantly. If Arthur wanted to hide half of his affinities, it meant he was deliberately concealing a vast portion of his strength. And the fact that he'd revealed this truth meant something else entirely. Trust. Gideon asked why Arthur would tell him something so dangerous. Arthur only grinned and winked, joking that the more Gideon knew about how special he was, the more free artifacts he could squeeze out of him. Gideon groaned, thoroughly exasperated, demanding proof one day. Arthur promised he'd show him eventually. Then, smoothly changing the subject, Arthur praised the pace of the ship's construction. He was genuinely impressed by how quickly the project had advanced. Gideon confirmed it with pride. In just a few days, while Arthur departed for his first day at Xyrus Academy, the massive steam-powered vessel, the Decothelis, would finally set sail. Arthur stepped out of Gideon's workshop with his thoughts spiraling. Calling the old artificer a genius almost felt like an understatement. In just a few short months, Gideon had gone from sketches on parchment to the early construction of a fully functional steam-powered ship. Not just a prototype, an entire vessel. The scale of it bordered on absurd. But Arthur knew better than to admire it as a marvel alone. That ship wasn't being built for prestige or progress. It was insurance. If the continent they were preparing to explore turned hostile, and Arthur suspected it would, then strength alone wouldn't be enough. Technology, preparation, and hidden advantages would decide survival. Complacency wasn't an option. His fingers brushed the bracelet hidden beneath his sleeve. With his fire and water attributes now concealed, he could finally push his earth and wind magic without drawing attention. Sharpen them, deepen them, close the gap. Every edge mattered. Lost in thought, Arthur drifted through the city streets, barely registering the people around him, until he slammed into someone. "Ah, sorry," Arthur said automatically, snapping back to the present. "I wasn't paying attention." The man he'd collided with didn't accept the apology. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and reeked of arrogance, flanked by 2 women clinging to his arms. His lips curled into a sneer as if Arthur's existence offended him. Arthur sighed internally. Of course. The man puffed up, seizing the moment like it was fate itself. With a condescending tone, he announced that he was a professor from Xyrus Academy, as if that alone placed him above the rest of the city. He lectured Arthur about manners, sneered at his long hair, mocked his build, and bragged about how a real man should look. Then he demanded Arthur apologize, properly, on his knees. When the professor reached out to shove him down, his hand stopped cold. Arthur didn't move, not an inch. Calmly, Arthur let a thin edge of mana seep into his voice. Not enough to cause harm, just enough to bite. He told the man he was willing to overlook the behavior, assuming alcohol had done most of the thinking for him, but patience had limits. The professor stiffened. The power behind Arthur's words hit him late, but hard. He recoiled, yanking his hand back like he'd touched something dangerous. Panic flickered behind his eyes before pride rushed in to cover it. He barked out threats instead. "No one speaks to a professor of Xyrus Academy like that." Arthur didn't reply. He simply turned and walked away. Furious and humiliated, the man shouted after him, spitting one last warning. If Arthur truly was a student at Xyrus Academy, then he'd better stay out of sight, because next time, discipline would be far harsher. Arthur didn't even slow down. Without looking back, he flicked his wrist. Something spun through the air and landed neatly at the professor's feet. A pendant? The Xyrus Academy emblem. Both women gasped. One of them whispered the name in disbelief. The professor stared down at it, his thoughts unraveling as realization struck. He hadn't even felt Arthur remove it. Later that day, Arthur returned to Helsty Manor. The moment he stepped through the gate, 2 blurs of motion charged him. Sylvie and Eleanor. They leaped at him with unfiltered excitement, arms outstretched. Arthur sidestepped smoothly. Both missed. He walked inside like nothing had happened, calmly announcing his return and asking where his parents were. Eleanor groaned dramatically, telling him Reynolds and Alice were in the living room with Elijah, and that a package from Xyrus Academy had arrived. Arthur followed the sound of voices. Reynolds greeted him with a broad grin, holding up a box like a prize. Elijah stood beside him, barely containing his excitement. Inside were their academy uniforms. Alice handed Arthur his set personally, her smile warm and proud. As Arthur held the fabric, a quiet thought settled in. His life had worn many faces: an orphan, a king, an infant reborn, an adventurer. Each role had shaped him, hardened him, taught him something new. Now, he was about to become a student. He wondered what this next chapter would demand of him. Whatever it was, he knew the world wasn't done testing him yet. Arthur's sleep ended violently. A shout tore through the morning silence. Before he could even sit up, Elijah grabbed his foot and yanked him upward. Groaning, Arthur reacted on instinct, snatching the still sleeping Sylvie and tossing her directly at his overly energetic roommate. It worked. Sylvie woke midair and chose violence. Claws met face. Elijah screamed, flailing as he tried to peel her off, while Arthur muttered sleepily that he was awake and would be ready in 5 minutes. Later, as Arthur got dressed, Elijah sat nearby nursing fresh scratches and glaring holes into the wall. He couldn't help bringing it up again. Arthur choosing to enroll as a scholar mage still bothered him. Arthur answered calmly. He wanted knowledge, not just combat. Theory mattered. Understanding mattered. That didn't mean he'd abandoned battle entirely. He still planned to take combat courses. But fighting kids his age didn't excite him. Learning did. Elijah warned him that scholar mages weren't respected by battle mages. Arthur laughed, asking if Elijah was worried. Elijah scoffed, saying he wasn't worried about Arthur. He was worried about the poor fools who underestimated him. Arthur promised to behave. His smirk said otherwise. They headed downstairs where the family was waiting. Reynolds urged them to hurry and eat. Eleanor sulked at the table, jealous she couldn't attend the academy yet. Arthur teased her, telling her to train harder if she wanted to catch up. Meanwhile, Elijah turned to Alice, asking for help healing his face. She laughed softly, already knowing exactly who was responsible, and motioned him over with a knowing smile. Reynolds couldn't stop smiling. He stood there, staring at Arthur, like the thought still hadn't fully settled in. His son, heading off to one of the most prestigious academies on the continent. With pride swelling in his chest, he turned to Alice and said, "They must have raised him well." Alice arched a brow. She had raised him. Reynolds coughed, rubbing the back of his neck, joking that the only time he really raised the kids was when they were in trouble. Alice nodded without missing a beat, her agreement light but decisive. Just then, a maid stepped quietly into the room and announced that the carriage had arrived. It was time. Arthur turned to his family, carefully keeping his emotions in check. He rested a hand on Eleanor's head, ruffling her hair gently, and told her to behave while he was gone, and to look after their parents. Eleanor nodded, pretending she didn't care, though the faint pout betrayed her. Arthur reminded her about the pendants he'd given her. Small, discreet, powerful. She was to wear them at all times. As he turned away, Reynolds scoffed loudly, pretending to be offended. Arthur shot back a grin, tossing over his shoulder a warning not to burn the house down during training. Reynolds laughed heartily, pride shining in his eyes as he called his son a cheeky brat. Arthur climbed into the carriage. As it pulled away, he took one last look at the house he'd grown up in. Warmth settled in his chest, the image of his family lingering long after the gates faded from view. The journey to Xyrus Academy wasn't long, but the weight of what waited ahead made it feel much farther. Though the academy stood within the same city, passing through its towering front gates felt like crossing into an entirely different world. The campus stretched endlessly, massive structures rising in every direction. Elijah stopped short, staring in awe, his mouth slightly open. Arthur nudged him forward, urging him along as they followed the flow of new students. A senior shouted orders, directing everyone to form lines in front of a colossal white building ahead. The structure loomed over them, carved with glowing runes that pulsed faintly with magic. Even Arthur paused, surprised by its scale and presence. When they reached the reception desk, the woman there greeted Elijah first, easily identifying him as a battle mage candidate with earth affinity. Then she looked at Arthur's form. Her expression faltered. Earth and wind, she stammered. Scholar mages almost never possess dual affinities. Arthur calmly confirmed it, asking if there was an issue. Flustered, the receptionist quickly waved it off, insisting there was no problem at all and hurried them along. Inside the grand hall, noise exploded around them. Hundreds of voices collided. Laughter, chatter, excitement, students cramming together. Some already familiar, others meeting for the first time. Elijah carefully navigated through the rows, apologizing as he squeezed past people until he found a seat. Arthur caught whispers nearby. A few students glanced at his uniform and scoffed, dismissing him as just another weak scholar mage. Arthur stopped beside them. "Excuse me," he said calmly. The glare he gave was sharp enough to cut steel. The whispers died instantly. The students shifted aside without a word, suddenly finding the floor very interesting. Arthur took his seat and surveyed the hall. The place buzzed with youthful chaos, loud, restless, alive. He'd forgotten just how overwhelming this age group could be. Then his gaze drifted to the stage. A lone podium stood at its center. Without warning, a blur appeared. The air shimmered, and Director Goodsky stood behind the podium. Arthur stiffened. Her calm, piercing eyes locked directly onto him. A chill ran down his spine. Slowly, Cynthia raised her hand. Her gaze never wavered. She snapped her fingers. Silence, complete and absolute. Mouths still moved. Laughter and whispers continued, but no sound existed. The noise had been ripped from the room entirely. Students stared at one another in shock, realizing they couldn't even hear their own voices. Arthur felt genuine awe. He knew she specialized in sound magic, but this level of control was terrifying. Cynthia's voice echoed directly into their minds. She apologized lightly, explaining she disliked shouting at her age, then welcomed them, the future scholars, warriors, and leaders of the continent, to Xyrus Academy. She admitted she'd almost delivered a long, boring speech. Almost. But this year was different. For the first time since the Academy's founding, more elves and dwarves were enrolled than ever before. The room erupted in applause, some enthusiastic, others stunned by the announcement. Cynthia smiled faintly and continued, saying that instead of speaking at length herself, it was better to let those who represented the students take the stage. She introduced the student council. One by one, they emerged. Elijah lit up when he spotted Lilia, cheering loudly and pointing her out. Behind her walked a tall figure with long, parted bangs. Then the final member appeared. Arthur's eyes widened. Tessia Erithal. She moved with effortless grace, confidence radiating from every step. Nothing like the girl he remembered. At just 13, she carried herself with a presence far beyond her age. Even Sylvie seemed to brighten at the sight of her. Whispers erupted throughout the hall. Princess of Eleanor, Good Sky's disciple. A full year of private training. Praise, awe, and envy tangled together as eyes followed her every movement. Boys whispered about what it would take just to catch her attention. Tessia stepped forward. "My name is Tessia Erithal," she said clearly, president of the student council. She congratulated the new students on their acceptance into the finest magical institution on the continent. Though she was technically a first year like them, she spoke with authority born from experience, having spent the past year observing the academy closely, especially the discrimination faced by scholar mages. Tessia didn't hesitate. She pointed out how something as trivial as a uniform had already sparked tension among them. If cloth and color alone could divide students, what would happen when race, bloodline, and history entered the picture? Her gaze swept across the hall. She urged them to abandon the mindset inherited from older generations, the same mindset that had carved hatred between humans, elves, and dwarves for centuries. Just as the royal families had cast aside pride to form the council, she called on the students to do the same. They were the future, and if history was ever going to change, it would be because they chose to change it. For a brief moment, the hall remained silent. Then it exploded. Applause thundered through the room. Cheers rang out. Whistles echoed from every corner. Even students who'd been skeptical moments ago were swept up in the momentum. Sylvie squealed loudly, bouncing in Arthur's arms as if she'd just seen the most amazing thing in the world, convinced she'd spotted her mother somewhere in the crowd. Arthur gave up trying to stop her. With a tired sigh, he pulled her closer and wrapped his arms around her. Resistance was pointless when it came to Sylvie's enthusiasm. Beside him, however, Elijah had gone completely silent. Arthur glanced over and immediately understood why. Elijah was frozen, staring ahead like his soul had just been stolen. His eyes were wide, his breathing shallow, awe written all over his face. Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Here we go again. I'm in love," Elijah whispered dreamily. Arthur sighed deeply. He reminded Elijah that this was, by his count, the 5th confession Elijah had made since leaving the carriage. Elijah snapped out of his trance long enough to protest loudly, insisting this time was different. Arthur wasn't convinced. Casually, he mentioned that the girl Elijah was staring at had changed quite a bit since they last met. Elijah spun toward him instantly. "What do you mean last met? How do you even know her?" The frustration spilled out fast. Elijah grumbled about Arthur somehow knowing royalty, academy elites, and now student council members, Princess Kathleen, Prince Curtis, and complained that Arthur clearly belonged to some secret circle he'd never been invited to. Arthur shoved him aside and told him to stop being weird. Then he kept walking. After the lengthy ceremony finally ended, the students were dismissed to their assigned dorms. Elijah groaned about how boring it had been, despite all the important speeches, still half dazed as they crossed the massive campus grounds. A group of girls passed by, stealing shy glances in their direction and giggling behind their hands. Elijah noticed immediately. Arthur didn't. Elijah couldn't understand it. The attention, the looks. Arthur ignored it all like it meant nothing. To Elijah, it felt like a tragic waste of perfectly good charm. Then, boom, a sharp explosion echoed across the campus. Without hesitation, Arthur and Elijah broke into a run. But as they closed in, Arthur slowed. He already knew what this was. Not an emergency. A duel. Two students stood at the center of a growing crowd, tension crackling thick in the air. A tall human boy sneered openly at a dwarf student, mocking his abilities and questioning his worth as an augmenter. "Stick to forging weapons," the human scoffed. "Leave real combat to those who matter." The insult landed hard. The dwarf snapped back instantly, fury blazing in his eyes. The human introduced himself with exaggerated arrogance. "Nicholas Dryle." The dwarf didn't hesitate. "Bronzen Boar." A challenge was issued. Accepted. Both raised their hands to the badges on their uniforms. The artifacts flared to life, one glowing blue, the other red, until the lights synced with a sharp ping. Duel confirmed. Arthur watched closely. These weren't ceremonial trinkets. blankets. The badges activated protective barriers, sealing the duel space and shielding both fighters and spectators. A clean, efficient system, one that encouraged real combat without unnecessary casualties. Nicholas summoned twin dueling swords from his dimensional ring, his stance relaxed, confident, borderline arrogant. Bronson answered by pulling a massive battle axe from his own ring, planting his feet firmly into the ground. The duel began. Elijah shouted encouragement toward the dwarf, earning irritated looks from nearby students. Arthur ignored them, his focus locked on the fighter's mana flow. Nicholas was a red core mage, but his control over earth mana was refined, trained, precise. Bronson, by contrast, was still black core. The odds weren't in his favor, but Bronson didn't hesitate. With a roar, he launched himself forward, kicking off a nearby tree to gain momentum. His axe glowed as earth mana surged through it, intent on ending the fight in one crushing blow. Nicholas met him head-on. His sword scraped violently against the ground as he charged, stone and dirt tearing free. As he swung, twin blades of condensed earth rose along the arc of his weapons. Arthur narrowed his eyes. Conjuring earth like that, as an augmenter at red core, was no small feat. Bronson bellowed and smashed through the incoming attack. Yellow light engulfed his body as his axe shattered the earth blades, fragments scattering like shattered glass across the barrier. He pressed forward. Gripping the axe head with one hand, he forced another surge of mana through it and brought it crashing down. Tremor smash. The ground shuddered. The impact blasted Nicholas backward several steps, but Nicholas recovered instantly. That smug grin never left his face. He rushed back in, blades dragging once more, another wave of earth rising to follow his strike. Bronson blocked. Too slow. One earthen edge slipped past his guard, slicing the side of his head. Snarling, Bronson spat an insult, accusing Nicholas of fighting like a coward, hiding behind tricks instead of strength. The crowd leaned in. This duel was far from over. Nicholas didn't bother arguing. He answered with violence. His foot slammed into the ground, and in an instant a narrow pillar of stone erupted upward beneath Bronson. The spike struck the dwarf square in the stomach, launching him into the air with a choked gasp before gravity ripped him back down. Crash. Bronson hit the ground hard. The glowing shield around his badge flickered once, and shattered. The duel was over, but Nicholas wasn't done. Slow, deliberate steps carried him forward. His expression wasn't triumph. It was disgust. He stopped beside Bronson's fallen body and clicked his tongue, looking down like he was staring at something beneath him. He mocked the dwarf's size, his pride, his worth. Each word sharpened with cruelty. Elijah felt it instantly. Something was wrong. The barrier was gone. The duel had ended. Yet Nicholas lifted his boot, not to walk away, to stomp. The intent was clear. Break an arm, make an example, remind everyone who owned power here. A spark ignited in Elijah's chest. He imagined himself rushing forward, stopping the strike, earning cheers, becoming the hero of the moment. Then Arthur stepped past him, not with dramatic flair, not with righteous fury, just one calm step forward. His voice rang out deliberately loud, carrying across half the courtyard. "Hey, isn't that the student council president coming this way?" The effect was instant. Nicholas froze. His head snapped around in panic, eyes darting wildly as he searched the crowd. His swords vanished into his dimensional ring in a heartbeat. His posture straightened. Arthur shrugged casually. "Never mind, my mistake." Elijah groaned under his breath. There went his heroic fantasy. Arthur turned to leave, a hand clamped onto his shoulder. Nicholas wasn't finished. He glared, humiliation burning behind his eyes. His voice dropped into a quiet threat, warning Arthur not to interfere again. Arthur didn't flinch. "The duel ended," he replied calmly. "Attacking afterward isn't just dishonorable, it's against Academy rules." Nicholas didn't care. "I'll remember this." He spat at Arthur's feet, and then, PTHK. A wet splatter hit the back of Nicholas's neck. The courtyard went still. Nicholas slowly turned around, his face twisted in pure rage. A vein bulged violently across his forehead. Sylvie blinked innocently, her timing flawless. Arthur lifted his hands with theatrical innocence. "Wasn't me." Nicholas didn't believe him. His hand plunged back into his dimensional ring. Twin swords flashed into existence again. Then, a voice cut through the tension like lightning splitting the sky. "Nicholas Dryle." The name alone stopped him cold. The crowd parted as the student council approached. At the front walked Tessia. Her presence alone shifted the atmosphere, freezing the moment into silence.